Well, hello, everyone. I went live just a couple seconds early. I was kind of sitting here. I was like, why don't I just go live? And all right, I'm just going to give people a few minutes just to kind of pop in. We're going to be doing a live reaction today, a rare Sunday live stream. But before we get started, I want to chat in. Like, let me know how's your weekend going so far. And I think this is going to be a pretty hilarious live stream, but it also could be horribly, horribly wrong. I don't know. I have no idea what we're going to find. That is why it is a reaction video, but I'm so excited to see so many people here today. Oh, Lady Phoenix Gray just became a member of the channel. Lady Phoenix Gray, you have the honor of being my very first member of my channel because I literally just flipped on the membership switch, I think probably an hour ago. So thank you for becoming a member of my channel. I'm actually going to talk about the memberships of my channel a little bit. I'm just going to give people a moment to kind of pop in, and I really do appreciate the support. All right. Let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So today we have a webinar from the University of Vermont. Now, many of you know that I'm originally from Vermont and I lived about an hour south of UVM. And I have actually always said that if I had not grown up in Vermont, I probably would have gone to UVM and had been perfectly happy with my experience there. So I was a little annoyed to see that they have done a whole series of diversity, equity, and inclusion webinars, including this one right here about finding answers together, turning the conversation to whiteness. We can't unlive a lot of the past, maybe none of the past, but we can certainly move forward and do good things, says Wanda Henning Grant, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as she kicked off the final teach-in of the Finding Answers Together series. Now, this is apparently the third part of this series. They did two other webinars, but we're just going to jump right into this one because listen, I know you guys, we're going to jump right into the deep end on this. Maybe if I like this one, I'll go back and watch the other ones and we'll do some funny reactions to that, but we have a little bit more information about what we can expect to find in this webinar on their actual YouTube page, which has 12 subscribers. So, I mean, I've also linked to this in the description below, so I'm not saying that you guys should let them know what you think by giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down. That is entirely, of course, up to you. And, give it a chance. Give it a chance before you go give it that thumbs down. But we'll see how this goes for them. So what they have in the description is this teach-in is the third of a three-part series that will focus on systemic racism in the United States. This session creates space to, okay, so they've got a grammatical error in the description that, gives me promise for this webinar. This session creates space to understand the social construction of whiteness, explores the way whiteness shows up for us as individuals, deconstruct whiteness at a systematic level issue, address audience questions, and so on and so forth. So we are going to watch this webinar together. Now, the reason that I think this is important, and I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff like this in 2021, is that I do think that it is very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have to understand what they're teaching. Okay, we have to understand what they're teaching. If we don't effectively understand what they're teaching, we cannot fight against it. And sometimes we might find out that stuff they're teaching is really kind of innocuous and like not all that bad. And sometimes we're going to find out that not all of it's grounded in critical race theory. Now, I'm going to bet you that this one is, but I actually just live tweeted a training just the other day that I thought was going to be horrible, and it just turned out not to be. It was like just some company grifting on this whole thing and wasn't really that bad in the first place. So we don't know what we're going to find, and we never want to judge these things up front. We want to know what they're teaching. We want to know the language that they're using. We want to know how they're the ideas that they're putting out there. That's the number one reason that we're doing this. The second reason, though, is that I think that it is very, very important to push back on these types of things in frankly their backyard. So I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff in the coming year to be able to actively push back on these people, and not only explaining what they're doing and why they're doing it, making it applicable to like the general person, which I think is something that most people don't really understand what this stuff is, but also I want us to show up. I want us to be asking questions. I want us to watch webinars like this and say that doesn't make sense. And here's the reasons why it doesn't make sense. And here's the reasons why we shouldn't listen to it. So those are the two main reasons I think that it's important to go through exercises like this. And we're going to be reacting to that webinar live. Now, I do want to do a quick plug before we jump into the webinar. Guys, I am going to be launching what I think is going to be a really fun initiative pretty soon as part of pushing back on all this woke nonsense. I'm going to keep it under wraps right this second because I'm not quite there yet, but I'm so close. I'm like this close. Now, if you want to be notified as soon as I launched this new initiative, the very best thing you can do, head over to drcarlin.com. The link is in the description below. And what you're going to want to do is to get onto my email list. It's right on the front page. I don't spam stuff out. I don't sell emails. It's just for me to be able to make announcements and things like that, and to have some other place that is not just social media to get in touch with people who are interested in this type of information and want to learn more. So you want to go over to drcarlin.com, get on the email list, and I will be sending out a notification when my new project launches. And I really do think that you guys are going to like it quite a bit. Now, part of this is I am going to be doing a lot of these live reaction videos, many more live streams just like this in 2021. I want to get everyone involved. I want you guys to have a chance to participate in all of this. And so you're going to be receiving much more information about that moving forward. But the other thing I want to plug is, guys, like I just said, I have my first new member, Lady Phoenix Gray, joined the channel just a couple minutes ago. I have turned on memberships to the channel. If you want to help support my work, there are two great ways to do it. Number one, and the way I honestly prefer, is joining my community on Locals. Locals is a private social platform where it is completely uncensored, and I will never be censoring it or any of those types of things. So it's a place for us to be able to say what we want to say without fear of being kicked off of it. My Locals is kb.locals.com. The link is in the description below. And then the benefits you get from Locals is you do get all of my videos ad free. So everything I do on here goes uploaded into my Locals, sometimes even before it comes onto YouTube, and everything will be there ad free. So you don't have to suffer through however many ads YouTube wants to place on my channel. You also, if you become a paid supporter in Locals, which starts at $5 a month, you get access to book clubs. You get access to our 2 times a week we do Zoom calls with the community, stuff like that. So that is my preference for if you want to support my work. However, I also understand that a lot of you just don't want to go off YouTube to be able to do stuff like this, which is why I turned on membership to my channel today. So now you can become a member on my YouTube channel. It does come with a variety of perks, including getting that little badge thingy next to your name. If you get into the higher levels, I'll follow you on social media. I'll do a shout out to you on social media, that sort of stuff. And I want to emphasize that I really cannot emphasize how much I appreciate the support. It enables me to be able to do this sort of thing, to be able to spend a lot of time doing it, to make sure that we are bringing this information to light and explaining to people what this stuff is. So whether you do it on Locals or through YouTube or wherever, I really do appreciate it. And even if you're just showing up today to watch along, I do appreciate that, guys, as well. And of course, you can always super chat in. I will be reading super chats throughout the conversation today. I will make sure to feature all of the super chats at some point, or at least read all the way through them at the end. If I don't get to yours during the live stream, I will make sure I speak to it at the end, answer any questions you guys have, that sort of stuff. Bill Clark kicks us off with our first super chat of the day. You're a better person than me. I won't listen to that crap ever, but it should be challenged all day long. Well, thank you, Bill. I very much appreciate that. All right. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, I just have to make sure that I'm setting this up properly so that you guys can actually hear the audio come through, because that would certainly be helpful. Okay, let's see. All right, I have my YouTube up, and let's see. I wonder if I can make that even bigger. Oh, that seems to be a little bit better. Okay, so we're gonna watch it like this, and let's get this party started. You guys ready to go? If you're ready to go, chat in, I don't know, ready or something like that, so that I know you're ready to go. Cheers. You know, what is that thing from Hunger Games? This is what we should do. We should do the Hunger Games. We should do the Hunger Games before every one of these live streams. What does that mean? God, oh God, remind me. I've seen the Hunger Games like 50,000 times. What does that mean? Like, what does that symbol mean in the Hunger Games? Someone chat in. This is gonna be, we're gonna do this, and I've forgotten totally what it is. Ken's ready. Hey, Ken. Evil Christo's ready. Seth is ready. Emily's ready. May the odds ever be in your favor. May the odds be ever in our favor. Okay, let's do it.
Hello and welcome to Turning the Conversation to Whiteness, the third in a three-part series titled Finding Answers Together, Exploring, Explaining, and Eradicating Systemic Racism. This event is sponsored by the Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion with support from the Center for Cultural Pluralism. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Vermont is located on
land blessing, the land blessing's coming up. Okay, ready? Land blessing.
On land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples
Land
for thousands
blessing.
of years and is home of the Western Abenaki people. UVM honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we virtually gather today. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Krista Hagen-Howe. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I serve as the diversity educator for the Center for Cultural Pluralism. And today,
okay, so I want to emphasize, this is a major public university. This is the largest university in the state of Vermont. Taxpayer dollars are going to pay this person's salary. Let's just keep this all in mind as we make our way through this webinar.
Today, I will be serving as your host. After I review a few details for the day, I will then ask our three presenters to introduce themselves. And before I do that, I'd love to just talk about some logistics for today. So as you've noticed, all participants are on mute by default, and only our presenters will be speaking during this event. However, we do encourage you to use the live events question and answer feature, so it's the Q&A feature, to ask questions or even share comments with other participants or our presenters. And we'll do our best to answer your questions. And
Shane is listening to me while driving home. Shane, just, be careful, buddy. Keep your eyes on the road. Do the right thing.
Address your comments during today's session. However, we would like to acknowledge that given the time allotted for this event, we may not be able to address every question or comment we receive, but we did extend this session. Usually our sessions go from 12 to 1, and we are going until 1:15 today with the hopes of just being able to answer a few more questions. This session is being recorded.
So one of the things I want to do in my new plan for 2021 with this new project I'm launching is I actually want to get a list of, like, a lot of these trainings are live available to the public. So it's through your local library or the university or something like that. They launch it so you can sign up ahead of time to go and watch the training live and ask questions live. And I just think what I want to do is actually create a calendar of these events so that everyone, including everyone in the chat right now, can go and sign up for these trainings and watch them live and ask questions. I think that this is perfectly fair. If they want to open up these trainings to the public and have people ask questions about what they're teaching, I think that it is perfectly acceptable for all of us to go sign up and watch them live and ask our questions during Q&A time. So that'll be part of the new project that I'm launching. All right, let's keep going. Put your pronouns in the chat if you have preferred pronouns.
The recording of the session will be available through our website, go.uvm.edu/amazing-grace, within the next few days. And this event is being live captioned by our colleagues at White Coat Captioning. And captions for this event are available at the stream text link that's in the event chat. I also just want you to get a feel of what to expect for today. And so if you've attended our other two sessions, you know the format, and today we'll be doing the same thing where we're kind of giving you a general introduction, idea of what to expect, and then our presenters will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll address as many questions as we can until we end right at 1:15 with some closing remarks. Before I introduce our wonderful presenters and have them introduce themselves, I want to talk a little bit about group agreements. We have a few agreements that we would like you all to keep in mind. These agreements are one part of Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race Protocol.
Courageous Conversations About Race Protocol. All right, I'm writing that one down on a sticky note for later. Courageous Conversations About Race Protocol.
And the first agreement we'd like you to think about is to really do your best to stay engaged throughout today. The second is to speak your truth. The third is to be open to experiencing some discomfort. And the fourth,
Okay, I want to point something out about the experiencing discomfort thing because it really pisses me off that they use this. This is what people use to indoctrinate people into cults. And one of the reasons that it bothers me is that there is legitimacy to the idea that when you are learning new things, when you're trying to build new habits, when you're trying to change the way you do things in life, you're going to feel uncomfortable. That is inherent. That's part of what pushing outside your comfort zone means. When you are doing something new, it is inherently going to be uncomfortable. But what these people do is what they're trying to do is get you to not trust your gut instinct, not trust your intuition, and explain it away by saying, "Ooh, this is going to make you feel uncomfortable. You're going to experience discomfort. That's just part of the process of becoming anti racist." And it's such bullshit. It's a way to get you indoctrinated into their little cult. All right, Bill, thank you for the super sticker, my friend. Caitlin said they won't answer all the questions from anyone who is a POC, no matter how long it takes. Seems racist to me. I don't disagree with you, my dear. And Nick, real Nick Miles from the Walkaway campaign, I identify as Hagrid. And you are a wizard, Carlin. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. I hope I'll be seeing you this week in our favorite capital. All right, let's keep going.
is, as we're exploring some of these conversations and perspectives on whiteness, to really expect and accept non-closure.
Expect and accept non-closure. So that basically means like you're not going to get answers to all your questions and you should just accept that up front. All right.
So now that you have an idea of how today will be formatted, I want to invite our presenters to go ahead and introduce themselves. Kyle, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Kyle, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Pardon my muted position there. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Kyle Dodson. I use he, him, they, their pronouns, and I'm the CEO president of the Greater Burlington YMCA.
Why, like, has anyone else noticed that there has been a dramatic uptick in people using like he, him, and they, them pronouns, or she, her, and they, them pronouns? Like, I feel like there's been a lot of uptick to that lately, and it's just to get victim points, right? It's like you can still be a he but also be a they at the same time and identify as whatever it is you're identifying as. Ralph says, my truth is that I am wealthy and you are not. That's probably true, Ralph, in a lot of these cases. All right, let's keep going.
I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to this conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Kyle. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Marcus. I use he, his, him pronouns. I work with a Boston organization called Community Change, though I live in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And connection to UVM, my colleague Donna Bivens and I have been working with the Center for Health and Wellbeing for the
even money. This guy confesses that he's a racist before the end of this webinar.
Last several years around this work.
Thank you so much. Wanda, would you like to introduce yourself and give a few opening remarks?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wanda Heading Grant, and I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Vermont, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. I have a few things that I would like to share first before we really get started, and I did not want to go any further without saying thank you. Sometimes people ask, what can they do? And sometimes it's the simplest things that they can do. And so I just really wanted an opportunity to really thank the UVM Communications area department. I also wanted to thank as well the Enterprise Technology Services, especially Peter Brooks. Thank you so much. Doctors Tiffany Spencer and Jesse Suter, thank you for being wonderful moderators. We could not have done this without you, as well as I'd like to thank President Garamella and Provost Patty Prelock in terms of they've just been great supporters and cheerleaders around this, and I appreciate your leadership as well as the deans and vice presidents. Thank you so much. And then, of course, how do I not thank Krista Hagen-Howe, thank you, and Paul Yoon and Dr. Sherwood Smith. Thank you so much to the team and everyone else in the DE&I division. It's just been wonderful. I have a few things that I wanted to say to you today. The second thing, my first thing was the thank yous. The second thing is really to just mention and talk about on June 3rd, I sent a communication out to our university campus. And I talked about my sorrow and my frustration in terms of the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis policemen.
You notice that she just blamed the entire police department in Minneapolis for George Floyd. I just want to point that out. This is someone who lives in a state that is 98% white, by the way.
And
does anyone know? I'm just curious. Does anyone know if Burlington, Vermont, is doing anything insofar as defunding the police? That just I just wonder if they are. Half an hour on introductions. I know, dude, but I don't know what they're gonna say, so I have to kind of go with it, you know.
And how I felt so just hurt to my core around what had occurred, and I really wanted to desperately be able to do something, and I wanted to be able to do something very meaningful and something that was substantial for myself and for our campus community. And so we started with the Amazing Grace program, and you can find that online. And then we went to this teach-in, and this teach-in about finding answers together with the focus on systemic racism. I really feel that in order to really truly get started and have a substantial impact is that you have to understand the root, the core of the problem. We often are so eager to jump in.
Yes, Wanda, let's hear a definition, a concrete definition of systemic racism. How much you want to bet she's not going to give a clear definition of systemic racism?
Into situations and things, and that can be good at times, but I also think that you should be quickly and often informed about what you're doing. And so I come to you and, and ask you to keep doing what you're doing. What you don't understand, continue to learn and reach out. Please remember that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color don't have all the answers, and don't look for directives from them all the time and information from them all the time. There's so much out there that we can collectively be partners on making a difference and having a change, not only in the larger world, but here in Vermont, and especially at the University of Vermont. The last thing I would just say to you is that we can't unlive a lot of the past, maybe none of the past, but we can certainly move forward and do good things. And some of you may be familiar with that concept and thought as I think about one of my elders, Maya Angelou. So, so if you're still wondering what can you do, and you want some quick answers, what I would do is direct you towards a mirror. Look at yourself. Start there. Look at the reflections.
I just want to do a quick pause to point out that she has not yet given a clear definition of systemic racism. No, she has not.
What action, what things can you do to make a difference? Start there, and I think you'll be in a good place. So enjoy what we are bringing to you. This will not be the last time. It is our last time in terms of this series, but we have plenty more thoughts and plans around bringing you wonderful, informative, and transformational programs and initiatives right here to our campus. So continue to join us. And some of you who know me well, what do I say? Let's roll, folks. Let's roll.
Let's roll, Wanda.
Thank you.
Let's
Krista?
roll.
Thank you so much, Wanda. So now that you have an idea of who will be...
Bam! Big slide. Systemic racism. Dar says, oh my God, she named her organization after a song written by a slave trader named John Newton. He did later become an abolitionist. Oh, the irony.
Speaking today, let's just quickly talk through a little bit around systemic racism. You know, for those of you who have attended our other sessions, you may have a great idea, and that's fantastic. We just wanted to do a quick reminder for folks, and then we will really start pointing the conversation in the direction of discussing whiteness and inviting our presenters to go ahead. So, you know, I do want to point out that there are 4 main levels of racism, right? Cultural or societal, systemic, interpersonal, and internalized. And whiteness can show up and does show up at all of these levels. And today, we're holding...
I just want to point out, in the context of Matthew's super chat here, the pushback required for our old speak is completely replaced by this new speak 2 to 3 generations from now. They literally have 4 definitions of racism on the screen right now. 4 definitions of racism.
Several conversations to really allow us to see the many ways whiteness shows up and to also see how it connects to systemic racism.
All right, I'm gonna read these definitions real quick because I'm not clear that she's actually gonna go through them. We have the 4 levels of racism: cultural and societal, messages that through art, media, societal norms, and cultural assumptions reinforce the idea that the white racial group is better than or superior to other racial groups. Now, I just want to point out here that I don't believe that that in general the white racial group is superior to anyone. And I don't think anyone here believes that. So why are they teaching that that's a thing? Why are they teaching that there are all these people through art and media and societal norms that are teaching that whites are superior? They are the ones teaching this. They are the racists in this conversation. It's absolutely absurd that they don't see the irony of this. This is absolutely Orwellian. The next one we have is systemic. Okay, so they are giving us a definition of systemic racism: laws, policies, and systems that together work to hold off and offer opportunities and advantages to white people and disadvantages people of color, which again assumes that white people are only ever going to help other white people. First off, it assumes that white people are the ones that are completely in charge of laws, policies, and systems, which, I mean, Barack Obama was president for 8 years. So, I mean, I don't think that you can really make that case, at least not during the Obama presidency. But of course, all this really came to head under Donald Trump, didn't it? Next up, we have interpersonal racism: individuals holding prejudice or bias, intentionally or unintentionally acting on racist ideas or assumptions. This is where they're going to say that white people hold unconscious, unintentional bias and are unintentionally racist towards other people. And that's just part of being white. I'm going to bet you that's exactly what they're going to argue. And then the last level of racism is folks. And folks is spelled F-O-L-X, folks. From all racial groups receive and internalize messages about groups that they belong to, as well as other groups. So those are the 4 levels of racism we're working in. Chris, thank you for the super chat. Carlin, I'm with you against this pernicious movement. And kudos to you, Chris, for the use of the word pernicious. What a good word. All right, let's keep going. Oh, actually, hang on. I got another super chat that just came in. I'm going to do this one too. Ralph, thank you again, Ralph. That's like your 3rd super chat. So easy for whiteness and racism to be interchanged by these people. That is exactly right. What these people believe is that all white people are inherently racist. And if you are not white, it is impossible for you to be racist. Racism is the realm exclusively of white people, and every white person is racist.
I want to point out, just a couple things around systemic racism to keep in mind in our conversations today. And one of the first things I want to invite you to think about is, this idea of an established way of doing something, right? Thinking about the way things are normalized. and the normalization of things, behaviors, cultures, and people, and really, the impact that that can have.
So what they're going to argue is that white people have established the way of doing things. And because white people established the way of doing things, it is inherently racist. That's what they're going to argue.
And another point that I think is one of the scariest things about systemic racism is this bottom bullet point here of not requiring intentional planning and initiative to perpetuate it, but really thinking about how if we're not actively thinking about disrupting, dismantling, and interrupting systemic racism, we're probably perpetuating it. And so, as we kind of think about that, I have a quote that I want to offer for us to consider that came from a 1992 interview with The Guardian that Toni Morrison did. And in that interview, she said, "In this country, American means white. Everybody else has to hyphenate."
No, wrong. Not true. That is a horrible thing to say. Oh my God.
And to understand race in the US, we have to understand whiteness. Whiteness, as in normalizing the white race and constantly measuring against it as the standard, the norm, and the way things are done.
Why is she saying that we should measure the standard way, the things the way are done against how white people do it? That is inherently racist. That assumes that white people are doing it the best possible way. Like, that is an incredibly racist statement to make.
Expected. And also recognizing that
it also, by the way, assumes that the way that white people that like if you're not doing things, or excuse me, that white people are always going to come up with the way to do things. And I mean, it's just like, that's just not true either. I mean, like, white people, like, spoiler alert, guys, white people screw up just as much as everyone else.
this accepted normality shows up in everyday interactions, from institutional and governmental decisions to interpersonal interactions, and of course, internalization as well. And thinking about too of the normalization of white identities absolutely having a direct relationship to the invalidation and denormalization of non-white identities.
So she's saying that by seeing whites as the correct way to do things, we are invalidating all other forms of identity, which again is not true. It is not true. And you know what I bet you she's not going to speak to in this webinar at all? I bet you there's not going to be one word uttered about people who are biracial. Because this really screws them up, is the biracial people, the biracial folks, if you will. This is what they don't know how to do with. I was actually watching a teacher training webinar a couple weeks ago where this is a teacher training webinar for teachers, where they argued that if the teachers have biracial students, the teachers should really encourage those students to not identify with the white part of themselves, because the white part of themselves is racist. They should only identify with the non-white part of themselves, which to me seems inherently problematic on like several different levels, not to mention not just for the student themselves, but also for the relationship they have with their parents, especially the white one. Has this woman or other speakers ever set foot outside a campus office? I swear it's like they've never talked to real people. I mean, I'm sure they have, but it like, also keep in mind that they're in Vermont, and Vermont is a special place. They're also in Burlington, Vermont, which is the most privileged place to be in the entire state.
And I think too about this concept of whiteness creates an element of racial etiquette, right? Some of these rules that are expected to follow and to go by. And for non-white folks, not going by those rules has serious detriments, harm, and even death.
Wait, okay, so she just said that white people create the rules that everyone has to follow, and not following those rules could potentially lead to death for anyone that's non-white. I'm pretty sure that's what she just said. Hang on. I'm going to rewind that.
And understand race in the US, we have to understand whiteness. Whiteness, as in normalizing the white race and constantly measuring against it as the standard, the norm, and the way things are done and expected. And also recognizing that this accepted normality shows up in everyday interactions, from institutional and governmental decisions to interpersonal interactions, and of course, internalized.
Well, if the police pull you over, you should listen to them. I mean, honestly, like, this is not like the most difficult thing in the world. If the police, pull you over, don't fight them. You listen to them and you follow their instructions. It's really not that hard.
As well. And thinking about too of the normalization of white identities absolutely having a direct relationship to the invalidation and denormalization of non-white identities.
What does it mean to normalize something? I'm honestly, in this context, and I mean, I know what I think normal means. It means that, like, it happens repeatedly. It's like a pattern that shows up over and over and over again. It's something that you can expect and predict with relative certainty. But how is it possible to normalize a skin color? Like, it just is. And again, she lives in Vermont. She lives in Vermont. If she cared about being around large populations that were diverse in terms of race, guess where she would not live? Vermont. Vermont is 98% white. This person probably very rarely sees a non-white person on an average day. So if you want to talk about normalizing race, like, you live in the place where it has been normalized as being white. Go live somewhere. Go to Chicago. Crying out loud. Caitlin says, how do people with white savior complex not see the error in their ways? Do they believe in any kind of system? Or do I believe in any kind of systemic racism? I don't see it anywhere. Yeah, I mean, I think there can actually be arguments made about this. I think, like, the thing that comes to mind for me is I did teach for America after, like, for alternative spring break in college. One year we went in, we worked in a school in the South. I went to school in Boston. We drove down to rural Arkansas or Mississippi rather. It's like right on the border between Arkansas and Mississippi. And we went to this very small town in Mississippi that was segregated. It was. Now, it wasn't segregated in terms of, like, legally, but there was a landlord in the town that owned all the rental property and would not rent it to Black families. And so because of that, you had the public school, which was almost entirely Black, and the private school, which was almost entirely white. And of course, the private school had much better resources and much better, like, whatever, than the public school. And so I can understand making the argument of things like that. Now the argument that I've heard in response to that is, well, redlining isn't legal. Well, yeah, I understand that, but it doesn't mean that I understand the argument of, this system was created when things were a heck of a lot more racist. And then we just continued to build on top of that system and on top of it and on top of it and on top of it. And so we never got rid of, like, the racist crap that it was built on. I understand that argument. But the problem is that, how do you fix that? How do you fix that problem? Is it by tearing down the entire system and building it up again? I don't think that's a feasible solution to the problem. So I think that when it comes to conversations based on race, there are legitimate conversations and discussions to make sure that we are continuing to make improvements to make sure that everyone has equal access to opportunity. That is a very valid conversation to have. I just fundamentally take issue with the argument that systemic racism is responsible for everything, and the only solution to it is to tear down everything having to do with white people. That just doesn't make sense to me at all. I don't think that's actually going to fix the problem. What it's going to do is it's going to make the country a heck of a lot more racist.
And I think too about this concept of, whiteness creates an element of racial etiquette, right? Some of these rules that are expected to follow and to go by. And for non-white folks, not going by those rules has serious detriments, harm, and even death. And so the other thing, I just want to kind of call back to this idea of systemic racism kind of being able to run by itself. Once a system and an expectation and a way of doing things are set up, it's then able to run and show up in so many interactions, systems, decisions, policies, and more. I could certainly go on for quite a while to discuss
I'm
this.
sure
and
she
I want to
could.
keep this pretty brief because I'm really excited for you all to hear from our presenters today. But, what we hope that you'll experience is, a moment to really think and reflect on whiteness in particular. And our speakers will dive deeper into some ideas around whiteness and ways it can and has showed up. And then we'll turn the conversation to you to explore and ask questions. And we'll try to answer as many as possible. And so at this point, I would love to invite Paul to begin his section of the presentation.
I'd like to start with a piece that was posted on the site, the National Association of African Americans in Human Resources, because I want to begin by naming something. And this was written about a month ago, maybe a little bit more than a month. Tomorrow morning, we return to another work week. We do this after days of mourning Black lives and protesting violence against Black people during a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black people. The expectation is that we maintain quote unquote professionalism, which typically means that we must be careful not to make our non-Black colleagues feel uncomfortable. We bite our tongues and mask our tears when we are expected to engage in business as usual. We try to act normal. This is not normal. None of this should be normalized. We wait with bated breath to hear our non-Black colleagues and organizations we work for affirm that our lives matter. We wait to hear from the companies that benefit from Black dollars affirm that our lives matter. We grapple with the deafening silence from those we thought were about us. We stand in the gap between knowing our lives matter and financially supporting our family.
Okay, I was gonna wait till the end of that quote, but I can't continue to bite my tongue. When you go to work at a job, you are paid to do a job. You are paid to go there and perform in a certain way. I'm sorry, if your company doesn't say Black Lives Matter and comes out with a whole campaign for Black Lives Matter and donates money to Black Lives Matter, that still does not change the fact that you entered into an agreement with that employer to show up and do a job for which they provide you compensation. You are free to leave that job at any time that you want. This right here, this is how Black Lives Matter has raised $10 billion. $10 billion. This manipulative goddamn gaslighting that goes on. If you don't want to work for a company, don't work for them. Just don't show up. Go work for someplace that expresses your values. But don't complain about how you're put upon because you have a job that isn't spouting the virtue signals that you want them to spout. That makes no sense. Anthony, thank you for the super chat, my friend. It's like they don't realize that America has a majority of white people as a population. Like, if I went to Japan, where a Japanese minority makes the laws, does that make me a freedom fighter if I break them as a minority? Like, my husband was actually just talking about this last night. He said to me, he's like, Carlin, if I'm a blonde, am I oppressed by brunettes because brunettes are the majority and blondes are the minority? Or if I have blue eyes, am I oppressed by people with brown eyes because brown eyes are the majority and blue eyes are the minority? It's the same thing. This is majority privilege. That's what they're talking about. And I'm gonna bet you money. I'm gonna place the bet right now that they are not going to address. They're not going to address biracial people. They're probably not going to address Latinos, and they sure as shit aren't going to address Asians. The people they are going to speak to in this training are Black, probably Black 100%, probably Native Americans because Native Americans have been making a comeback for some reason. And I think that that's probably where it's going to end. They are not going to speak to everyone who is non-white. Chad says, it dawned on me, it is always a systemic or institutional problem because there are not enough individual examples. Most people write this guy off. Yeah, Chad, you are exactly right. The reason that they've made this about systemic racism is because this gives them a perpetual problem to fight that they don't even have to define. They don't even have to define it in a way that's clear. They can just say it's systemic racism, and that's all that they have to say. And then I have one last super chat that came in that I just want to acknowledge. Matthew, thank you, Matthew. did we not have the race thing sorted out in the 80s and 90s when white people did not see race and treat everyone the same? Like, why are all these people telling us about white privilege? Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would not say that we had the whole race thing sorted. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that I was raised mostly, like, my formative years were in, like, the late 80s, the 90s, right? Where they taught us that everyone, like, treat everyone the same. Essentially treat everyone the same. I thought that was a pretty good rule of thumb. You don't, like, it's not that I can't see when a black person is standing in front of me. Like, of course I can see that they're black. I don't like using the word colorblind because I just don't think it's accurate. Like, I can see that you're black, right? Am I going to treat you differently because you're black? No. Why would you want me to? Why would you want me to treat you differently based on the color of your skin? I just don't think that makes sense. All right, I'm going to ask if you guys are enjoying this so far. Please hit that thumbs up button for Greg. Please hit that thumbs up button. I really appreciate it. All right, let's keep going.
Understand that this is the reality for many Black professionals. Understand the impact of your silence. And I think one of the ways as I think about whiteness is to get at that silence. And I think, and I hope through this conversation we're going to have today, we'll bring some of that out. And so part of that is we really don't know our own history. And that's why I started the presentation with this quote from a man named Ed Clark. It's, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And much of this work is about really examining the lenses that we have, that we view and interpret reality through, and where they came from and what they are. Another quote that's been really important to me, and it's on my email, is that it's a Daniel Bornstein quote, and it's, education happens when you learn something you didn't know you didn't know. So I was thinking about some of my own significant learnings in this process, and there's a lot, but I'll just start with one, and that is that this idea of race is a social construct. And it's already been alluded to, but how whiteness is normalized, is normatized.
So every time they say race is a social construct, they're talking about how whiteness is normalized. And again, I want to emphasize, I don't buy into the idea that whiteness is normalized. I think that that's ridiculous. That inherently says that white is normal and everything that's not white is abnormal. And I don't buy into that idea. That is an incredibly racist idea to buy into. If you believe that white people are normalized, that to me seems to be inherently problematic. And I don't think that anyone who doesn't study this anti-racist nonsense actually believes that.
In fact, if you think, for a lot of people, in my experience, if we say we're going to be talking about race, the assumption is we're going to be talking about Black people or Blackness. When Toni Morris...
No, I don't think any of us can make that assumption anymore. I think all of us now know that anytime we are having a conversation about race, it's going to be about how white people are inherently racist and don't understand their unconscious bias and need to unlearn their whiteness. I think that all of us are fully briefed on the fact that this will be the conversation about race perpetually moving forward for a good long time.
Writes a novel, it's a novel about race. When any white writer writes a novel, it's a novel about reality. It really came out for me, if you remember, a number of years.
Did he just make the assumption that white people only write about white characters? Because I thought that wasn't allowed. I thought, like, wasn't there a novel like this past year that was in Oprah's book club and won all sorts of awards that was like a white author writing about the experience of an immigrant or something like that? It was like she was writing about a non-white experience and she got canceled for it. She was like, they said, like, how dare you, white author, write about non-white people? So do we want white authors to write about the entire spectrum of people and experience, or do we want them only to write about white people? I mean, it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't. The Wanderer says, the super chat originally said the women's movement is cancer mainly because it created this, but YouTube made me edit it to say that. Well, listen, I don't think the women's movement is cancer. I think, like, listen, part of what really drives me crazy about this is that like it takes everything to such extremes. I think fundamentally the women's movement was actually probably a pretty good thing for people like me. Listen, there was a time that I wouldn't have been able to have credit cards in my own name. There was a time when I would have needed my husband's approval for everything. I'm really glad I don't live in that time. That would have sucked. Okay, so there are sometimes the wrongs that need to be righted. There is progress in all of this. It's just like it gets taken too far, and I'm frankly on both ends. I think the left takes it too far when they say all white people are inherently racist. I think that the right takes it too far when they say that women shouldn't even be speaking up about the times they've been harassed and all those things as part of the movement that I can't say because I will instantly get demonetized now and forever on YouTube because of it. I think that both of those things are equally wrong. Extremism on either side is wrong.
Years ago, when Justice Sotomayor was up for confirmation, and her race, particularly, and her gender were questioned, and how that was going to impact her decisions. And I would.
Did anyone really think about Sonia Sotomayor's race in regards to how it would impact her decisions? Maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I really don't remember that. I really, really don't.
Was so proud to be a white guy at that time because it was so clear that for those of us that are white, our racial identity and our gender identity and our identities have no influence on how we look at the world. I say that. I hope people are aware that I'm making a joke about that, but that whiteness is so normalized that for me, my reality is just normal reality. And so a big learning in this idea that race is a social construct is that if race is a social construct, then my race, my quote unquote race, I'll say that, has been constructed as well.
If race is a social construct, then why are we even having a conversation about systemic racism? Wouldn't systemic racism then be a social construct? Wouldn't any of the forms of racism that they defined at the beginning be a social construct? Like, if race in one instance is a social construct, then it's a social construct for everything. That doesn't make any sense. Dragonwater says, during that time, you weren't able to have credit cards in your own name. Your husband was also legally responsible for your debt and crimes. Well, I don't think that that's actually good either. That's not actually good. I don't think it's good for my husband to be responsible for my debt or my wrongdoings. I don't think that's good for the husband. I don't think that's good for the wife.
I've been racialized, and that's had a profound impact on those lenses that I was talking about how I see and interpret reality, how I think of myself, how I think of others, how I think about public policy, how I think about everything. And so the reality is that when I'm here in the Northeast Kingdom and I'm sitting with all white people, I'm in highly racialized space. Race is happening all the time, and we never even see it.
Okay, just to give you guys context, when he's talking about the Northeast Kingdom, what he's talking about is like the very upper portion of Vermont where no one lives except white people. Literally. I mean, you think Vermont's white in general. The Northeast Kingdom is probably the whitest of the white. And now he's talking about how race is a social construct in the Northeast Kingdom. No, dude, it's not. They're all white. Matthew says, are these people white supremacists? Well, they're the ones saying, well, I mean, let me put it this way. They're literally the ones saying that white is normal and everything that is non-white is abnormal. I don't agree with that. I think that's stupid. I think that anyone who says that white is normal and anything that is non-white is abnormal is probably a white supremacist. Yeah, I'm going to make that argument. Yes. Derek says sexual harassment isn't a woman's issue. Anyone can be harassed. Yeah, but dude, I am not getting into this conversation right now. I am absolutely not. And I think that anyone who thinks that that is an equal issue is wrong. I'm sorry. I've seen enough of it in the workplace. It's like, it is not an even 50-50 split. It's not. Paul Robinson says, as a black man, I want to say to these people, stop trying to help us. We are not victims. You are doing more harm than good. Well, thank you, Paul, for that. I mean, listen, it honestly bothers me all the time when these like white saviors try to treat black people like they're victims. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all, especially, and I don't mean any offense by this, Paul, but like, especially black women do not need people to save them. They don't. They really don't. Demolisher says, I can't wrap my head around what it is that these systemic racism folks want. It's like they want to be inclusive and exclusive at the same time. Yes, I think this is actually a really fair point, and we're probably going to hear this throughout this webinar. We certainly heard it in the last webinar I did a reaction to, where they were literally throughout the entire webinar saying two contradictory things in the same sentence sometimes. So keep an eye out as we're doing this for the contradictions that come up. I will try to point them out as much as I can, but I might miss them. So please chat in if you see a contradiction. And then we got one more from Anthony. Anthony says, these guys are projecting so hard they can point themselves at a wall and show off PowerPoint presentations. Well done. Well done. All right, let's keep going, guys.
We never even think about it. It's the ideology that we swim in. It's the water that we swim in. So we know, and I could go into a lot of detail about this, but that race is not a biological reality. While the way we...
I'm sorry. Did he just say race is not a biological reality? So if I have two white parents, am I going to be born black? Probably not. Probably not, unless there's like, you know, back in the gene pool somewhere, like someone got it on with someone. I mean, like, that makes no godly sense. How is race not a biological reality? Spoiler alert, guys. Spoiler alert. I know this is going to shock all of you. My parents were white. My parents were French and Irish. They were white as white could be. I know that's shocking. And the reason I'm white is because I have white parents.
We look, our physical appearance, our skin color is genetically determined. There's no underlying genetic reality to the groups that we have created or we have assigned different races to. James Baldwin said that no one is white before they came to America. And it's obvious here, he's not saying that people, you know, there are people of different quote unquote colors, but what he is saying is says that unless you live in a society that recognizes these differences as socially relevant, they don't exist. But while there's no biological reality to race, it's...
Wait. I just need to listen to that again. I'm sorry. I was pouring a drink. I need to listen to that part again. Hang on.
That no one is white before they came to America. And it's obvious here, he's not saying that people...
No one is white before they came to America. One more time for posterity.
Our physical appearance, our skin color is genetically determined. There's no underlying genetic reality to the groups that we have created or we have assigned different races to. James Baldwin said that no one is white before they came to America.
No one is white before whiteness started in America. The Pilgrims were definitely not white. My ancestors who founded Quebec, definitely not white.
And it's obvious here, he's not saying that people, you know, there are people of different quote unquote colors, but what he is saying is says that unless you live in a society that recognizes these differences as socially relevant, they don't exist.
You know, I'm deadly serious when I say that my ancestors founded Quebec. They founded what is today Quebec. And I kind of wonder, like, so apparently when they came from France and they came over to settle in the new land, in the new world, in Quebec, which is in Canada, like, they weren't white when they founded Quebec, but when they migrated down into Vermont, which is where a lot of my family is from, they were white when they lived in Vermont, but not when they lived in Canada. Do I have that right?
But while
and definitely not when they lived in France.
There's no biological reality to race. It's very real socially and politically and economically.
There is no biological reality to race, but it is very real socio-economically and politically. Okay.
So I'd like to spend some time thinking about whiteness and how it was constructed. And I want to go back to, we can go back to...
All right, I'm just going to read what he's got on this slide because I don't believe he's going to actually read it. And I want to make sure we have it on the record. White supremacy and whiteness. White supremacy is a system of economic and social exploitation, domination, and marginalization of those constructed as people of color or other than white. So they have just changed the definition of white supremacy. It is held in place by militarization and other forms of violence, including the poverty they create. They have just said that the police are the ones enforcing the system of white supremacy. And it depends on a hierarchy of race that constructs those defined as black at the bottom, those defined as white at the top, those who are indigenous as disappeared, other people of color as dangerous, expendable, and other foreign, and white people who challenge the system as fanatics or traitors. Okay, so I just want to point something out. A couple minutes ago, I predicted that they were going to address black people and indigenous people and really no one else. And what have they done in this? They literally addressed black people and indigenous people and no one else. Let's keep going.
Pre-Columbus, even, we can talk about the justifications of, particularly from the church, but from political justifications for exploration and conquest. And, we can go back and talk about the doctrine of discovery, which essentially established a spiritual and political and legal justification for the colonization and seizure of lands of people who were not Christian. And so I want to begin with the way we talk about white supremacy in our work, because I think when a lot of people hear the concept of white supremacy, they think we're talking about, they go to skinheads, or they go to the Klan, or they go to Charlottesville, and that's a reality. But when we're talking about white supremacy, we say that white supremacy is a system of economic and social exploitation, domination, and marginalization of those constructed as people of color or other than white. It is held in place by militarization and other forms of violence, including the poverty they create. It depends on a hierarchy of race that constructs those defined as black as the bottom, those defined as white as the top, those who are indigenous as disappeared, other people of color as dangerous, expendable, and or foreign, and quote unquote white people who challenge the system as fanatics or traitors. And I think that's another reason we really like the term by POC, because it really names that history when we're talking about
by POC, black, indigenous, and people of color. So it only emphasizes black and indigenous people, and everyone else gets jumbled into the third category.
About black, indigenous, and other people of color. And if you can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to, so as we think about this system, we go back to Dr. King's triple evils. Dr. King talked about the triple evils of poverty, militarism, and racism. And my colleague, Donna Bivens, made this connection a number of years ago. But so the reality is what we have here, Europeans came to this land, they wanted stuff, right? And then that ties in to the three poisons of Buddhism that keep us from enlightenment on the right-hand side of this column.
Wait, Europeans came to this land and they wanted stuff. That seems to be a gross oversimplification of I mean, like, yeah. Okay. Hang on, I got a super chat. John says, can we stop changing the meanings of word to fit political narratives? I think that ship may have sailed, John.
But so they wanted stuff. That's greed. You can't just come and take people's land or their labor. You have to, it takes violence and militarism. And that corresponds in the three poisons with hatred. And finally, in order to do that, you need to justify it. And so the justification of that is racism and white supremacy, and that's the delusion. So from here, I want to go back. And if you think about it, then that people think that race created racism, that race prejudice.
How could race possibly create racism when race is a social construct?
This is what created racism. But the reality is it's the other way around. We wanted land, we wanted resources, we wanted cheap labor, and then we created the inferiority of race.
We created racism because of greed. Fundamentally, he's not acknowledging that not all white people partook of slavery. Not all white people were complicit in the system. And in fact, an awful lot of white people fought and died to overcome this system. In fact, our Declaration of Independence was written in the way that it was because Thomas Jefferson fundamentally did not agree with this system and wanted it to go away.
So when our land first started getting colonized, we could take it back to Jamestown. And in Jamestown, the first recorded case, and this is, we know that the Africans were here much way before this time, but the first recorded case is 19 Africans coming off of a Dutch slave ship and coming into Jamestown. And when they came into Jamestown, there may have been some skin prejudice here, but they were not seen. They were treated as indentured servants. They were treated the same way as the impoverished whites who were coming over as indentured servants. They could work off their indenture. They could own land. They could vote. They could do all of those things. And so as we move through the 1600s, we begin to see a major shift. And that's what I'd like to talk about, because really the story of race in this country is the story of labor. And so as we move through the 1600s,
the story of race in this country is the story of labor. But again, I thought race was a social construct, so how could that possibly be true?
We see differences being created between whites and blacks. And so for a first case in 1640, an African, and again, I'm using John Punch. It wasn't clear what country in Africa he came from. We often, just conflate Africa with a country. It's a continent. But he and
how much you want to bet that this guy at one point thought that Africa was a country? I'm just saying.
He and two white indentured servants escaped. They were captured, and they in the court case, the two white indentured servants had their indentures increased. John Punch was given a sentence of enslavement for life. It's the first recorded case where that happens. It's a separation of white and black, and we see several laws happening. Laws around intermarriage. An interesting law, some of you may know, but in English law, the status of the child was based on the status of the father. But here in Virginia and in the colonies, that's changed. The status of the child is the status of the mother. And if you think about what that means, we know that history, that African women who are being raped by their owners, their children would be enslaved. So as we go into the 1600s, we begin to see these multi-racial rebellions, and they start around the 1660s, and they culminate with Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. And in Bacon's Rebellion, and I don't want to glorify Nathaniel Bacon, because a lot of this rebellion,
we can't glorify people that do not fit our narrative.
It was really about
we will simply use their stories to advance our narrative and not glorify them at all.
Their access to one of the issues is people indentured servants get freed. They need land. And so this was really about taking native and indigenous land. So that's I'll put that aside, but
I love how they use stories to try to advance how America is fundamentally racist against black people, and then they were like, "Oh, but we can't actually make these out to be we can't advance these stories because they were also racist against Native Americans." It's like there's always going to be something.
It was a 9-month rebellion. They burnt the tobacco fields. They burnt Jamestown down. The ruling class saw that this could not continue. And they very clearly and very quickly, if you look at legislative decisions and legal decisions, we can see changes in laws that very clearly separate whites and blacks. And this is really,
and those laws have since been overturned and ruled unconstitutional for many, many reasons.
They needed a consistent labor force, and they couldn't have one if that force was banding together to challenge their authority. So coming out of this, many laws, I have no time to go into this history in any detail, but many laws were coming out of this, laws about intermarriage.
No, we can't go into the history in detail. We can just be selective about the things that we highlight, the things that best make the case that America is a fundamentally racist country.
Slave codes, slave patrols, and many of you have been hearing recently how the slave patrols are really our first police force. And if we look at what
slave patrols are our first police force. So he's now actively trying to connect the police with slavery. Okay.
it was saying to people, it was saying to whites, it was saying to poor whites, we're going to put you in charge here. There's a psychological, there's a psychological sense of the meaning of that. And so whites are continually getting messages, and they're both material and psychological, that say that you're closer to us. They're getting messages that divide them from blacks. And so as we think about this, the message to white, and Tim Wise says this, he says, we're going to let you put our uniform on and sometimes sit on the bench, but you're never going to get in the game. By 1691, we have a definition of white, and we have a constructed definition of race in law. And whites weren't
a constructed definition of race in law. Okay.
given much, but they were given enough to ensure their allegiance.
Guys, just so you know, every time I kind of say okay, it's that's my way of saying I think that this is patently absurd on its face and needs no additional commentary. If you'd like me to do additional commentary about why it's absurd, please chat in. But I think that some of this stuff is just so blatantly absurd, just on the face of it, that I cannot actually believe that it comes out of people's mouths with a straight face. I really can't.
What W.E. Du Bois calls the psychological wages of race. And so this creates, rather than creating a multiracial coalition of people who had common interests, it creates a multi-class coalition of white people. And so really the history of this is wealthy white men dividing and conquer, creating policies that cause division and conquer. And so what we really have here is the emergence of the creation and the maintenance of whiteness becomes crucial in facilitating economic growth.
The maintenance of whiteness becomes crucial in facilitating economic growth. He's read People's History of the United States, hasn't he?
Capitalism. Racism and capitalism are deeply intertwined. Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, really looks at this. But at the same time, the system of enslavement is developing, capitalism is developing.
Well, the thing of it is, too, is this is obviously a very selective history lesson. It's a selective history lesson where he's trying to only look at information that frames his story. But what he's talking about, it bears very little resemblance to the context that we are living in and experiencing today, and it completely ignores the amount of time and effort and energy and work that a lot of people in the civil rights movement did to overcome this very thing. I don't think anyone that's watching this right now would say that slavery was a good thing. I think we can all fundamentally agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we can all fundamentally agree that slavery was awful and wrong and shouldn't have happened, and that we're pretty glad it doesn't exist anymore in this country. I think we can pretty much agree that a lot of the Jim Crow laws of the South, it's a good thing they don't exist anymore. I'm completely in favor of all of that being gone, a distant memory that we have learned from and improved our society. I also want to say again, for people that may have just entered the chat, there are very real conversations that we need to continue to have about race. I just don't think doing it in this context is helpful, and it's not actually going to solve any problems. Brent, thank you for the generous super chat, my friend. His point about legislation is poignant. Legislation normalizes the message go to everyone. There is hierarchy among some whites and blacks based on skin color and shade. Doesn't mean everyone is effective. I think there are arguments you can make about legislation in terms of being reflective of the times that they were in. But what he's not talking about is how a lot of this stuff has since been overturned. A lot of it by the U.S. Supreme Court, but at least in state courts or in even the federal court or even in the federal government. A lot of this stuff has already been overturned because it's not relevant to where we are as a society now and the values that we hold. And if you want any further proof of that, we can even look at the ADL's website and see that even they acknowledge that things like the KKK only have 3,000 members in the country. It is no longer a relevant group because society has said, no, we don't want you guys here. We don't appreciate your ideas. Go off into your little corner, do your thing, but you are not part of polite society anymore.
And there's something else that's happening here. Jumping ahead. one of the first things that was passed in the national legislature was the Naturalization Act of 1791. And they were sitting around saying, we have this great land, we know people are going to want to come here. Which people do we want coming? And essentially what they said, and this was held in place for 130 years, they said that only white Europeans can become citizens. And that was one of many massive affirmative action programs for white people. In my own reality, all of my grandparents came here in the early part of the last century. The Polish Jews and Lithuanian.
His ancestors were not white until they came here. Let's just remember.
Catholics on either side of the family. And even though they faced a lot of discrimination, they could become citizens, they could own property, they had more access to wealth and all of those things because of that. It's what George Lipsitz calls the possessive investment in whiteness. Moving into the 1800s, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act lasted from 1862 to 1934. 270 million acres, about 10% of U.S. land, was given away to about 1.5 million Americans. And it was families of both born in the U.S. and immigrants. Only about 4,000 or 5,000 Black families received that benefit. In the year 2000, it was calculated that the number of descendants of families that got land was estimated to be 46 million people. About a quarter of the adult population at that time can trace their family wealth and property ownership to that policy. Again, a massive affirmative action program for white people. And then going on later into this, we look at FHA policies and housing policies that I don't have time to go into, but federal government policies combined with banking and real estate policies created the racial geography of the country between 1933 and 1964, $120 billion in federal subsidies, 98.9% or 98.5% of those subsidies went to white people. It's why today we have a.
I just want to note that this is training that is done in organizations paid for by taxpayer dollars. This training is at a public university for public university employees paid for by taxpayer dollars. This training is something that an organization would pay thousands of dollars to have their employees complete. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page there. Thousands of dollars.
Racial wealth gap, anywhere between, depending on which study you look at, anywhere between 10 and 20 times in the United States. In Boston, the mean net wealth for whites is 245,000.
Did people hold slaves in Boston? Did I miss the memo that slaves were readily available in Boston? Okay.
The mean net worth for Blacks is $8. So there's this possessive investment in whiteness. At the same time, I want to go back now, and I want to go back to Thomas Jefferson, the man who probably most embodies the contradiction that our nation was founded in. And Jefferson says in Notes on the State of Virginia, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind. And Jefferson sets on, he basically says, I'm postulating this, but it's up to science to prove this. And science developed.
Thomas Jefferson was inherently against slavery. It's why he wrote the Declaration of Independence the way that he did. He owned slaves, that was true, but he did not believe in slavery. He did not believe that slavery should be a system that should be perpetuated long term. Jeff Horton, keep up the pushback, and thank you for leading us back to sanity. Thank you, Jeff.
Develops, there's a whole history then of science and of anthropology of just the justification for the supremacy of white people. At the same time, the system of enslavement is evolving. We often think of the system of enslavement as just it's been the same, but by 1860, there's 4 million African descended people enslaved in the country. Their worth is greater than all of manufacturing, all of the railroads. And there's, again, I don't have time to go into this, but it's the basis for the wealth of the nation. It drives the industry in the North. It creates investment investments. There's insurance policy. All the major investment firms.
I want to say again that I think there is actually a case to be made for thinking about, I even hate to use the term, but it's their term, like systemic racism in regards to things like redlining. Is redlining illegal now? Yes. Does that mean that there are not remnants of that system that exist because you had things that were built on top of that were based on that system? Well, yeah, I mean, they probably do. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge these things. Listen, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in these conversations. You want to make sure that we're making changes that make sense and that are actually going to help people. Calling all white people racist is not going to actually help solve any problems, but there are things that we can look at and say, maybe we should get rid of this law or that law or change this thing or that thing because it does make sense and will end up helping people, and it brings more equity of opportunity to the situation. I think those are perfectly fair conversations to have, and we should be having them, but we need to have them in a nuanced way. And sometimes I see people, and I'm seeing some people in the chat, like, you want to throw the baby out in the bathwater. You say, well, this thing is illegal, so it's no longer a problem. No, that's not entirely true. And I think that's not entirely true. There are still conversations that we need to have about this, but I don't want to see people lose their humanity because they're pushing back on the evil that this type of training is perpetuating.
All the major insurance companies are involved in this process. So there's this large systemic economic reality to this. And so I'm gonna stop here in terms of the history, but ultimately, when we're talking about whiteness or white culture isn't a culture it's not an ethnic culture. It's really it's a political culture.
Whiteness is a political culture.
It's about domination. And
whiteness is a political culture about domination. This guy doesn't like himself very much, does he?
James Baldwin said it well. He said, the only thing whites have that black people need is power, and nobody holds on to power forever. And it's very clear. He's saying here, there's nothing essential.
No one holds on to power forever, because ultimately all this about is power, guys. That's ultimately what this is. If you're new to this type of thing, if you haven't seen one of these webinars before, what you're going to find over and over and over again is that all of this is about power. All of this is about pushing people down who you want to take power from. That is what this type of stuff is all about.
About race. There's no relationship between race and athletic ability or intellectual ability.
The NBA might have an issue with the idea that there is no correlation between race and athletic ability.
The only difference is that difference of power. And so that brings me to the next slide that I just want to put up quickly here. So when we're talking about a system, this is a little bit different than what was shown earlier, but it's really the same thing. But we talk about the system operating on these 4 dimensions: internally, interpersonally, institutionally, and culturally. So this system of racism is impacting all of these interconnected dimensions. And I want us to think about particularly what is the relationship of race in your lives? What has been the impact of race? How has this living in a system of racism influenced the internal lenses that you?
How is living in a system of racism impacted your internal lenses? What he did there is he just made the base assumption, and he's forcing the audience to agree with it. How has living in a system of racism impacted yada, yada, yada? What you're due to answer that question is you are forced to agree with the notion that you are living in a system of racism.
You use to impact reality, and what's the meaning of that? And how does that connect to all of these other dimensions? We live in this culture where we live in these institutions. We take this all in internally. This impacts our interpersonal relationships, both among our own race and across race. So we've had 400 or 500 years of this. How could it not be living in us? How could it not be in our heads?
We've had 400 or 500 years of racism. How could racism not be living in us? How could it not be part of our social construct?
As Raphael Ezekiel says, that, if you live next to a cement factory, you're going to be breathing in cement dust all your life. And you take that in and you breathe it in and it becomes part of you. And for me, that's been an important piece of this because I wasn't born into this system. I wasn't.
You were, in fact, if you live in Vermont and you're white, you were, in fact, literally born into the system that you're talking about. That's literally true. Colin says 36-hour bus ride to DC. See you there, Doc. Safe travels, Colin. I wouldn't want to be taking the bus, my friend, but I will be flying in on Tuesday, and I can't wait.
Responsible for creating this system, but once I learned about it, once I began to understand the system and this history, it was no longer a choice. I no longer had the leisure of being clueless about it. Now it's a choice. And so
hey, because I see Mistopheles here, I just want to note I have actually learned how to pronounce your name. If you would just said Mistopheles like in Cats, I would have known what you were talking about, like Mr. Mistopheles. I feel very proud of myself that I learned how to pronounce your name. That's all I wanted to say.
Big piece of this work is to really, as Wanda was saying earlier, is to really think about our own learning around this issue. And I'm going to leave you with one other quote here, which is the next slide. And it's a quote from Eduardo Bonilla Silva.
Wait. I saw someone in the chat say something. Hugh says, did he mention the white Jews, Irish, Poles, and Italians were seen as a different race and discriminated against? No. You know why? Here's why. Robin DiAngelo writes about this in White Fragility. They don't actually address those populations at all, ever, because they say they've assimilated to whiteness. Not making that up. It's in White Fragility.
Racially minoritized people see whiteness all the time and in everything in you. Indeed, it is a prevailing entity. Although you, meaning people who look like me, have been socialized to deny whiteness, you too know it exists. Denying its existence offers comfort and a sense of innocence, hence feelings of white guilt that emerge when whiteness is named. When you refuse to acknowledge whiteness or shy away from it because of the discomfort, you engage with what Bonilla Silva calls racism without racist.
Okay, so I know I have non-white people watching this, and so I honestly just want to ask you, and listen, I'm not discounting the fact that some of you might be actually hate watching this, I get it, but I want to ask you, do you agree with the sentence, racially minoritized people see whiteness all the time in everything in you? Indeed, it is a prevailing entity. Although you have been socialized to deny whiteness, you too know it exists. So with the people who are not white in the chat, would you agree that you see whiteness all the time in everything white people do in so far as how they're defining whiteness in terms of racism? I'm honestly curious. I'm honestly curious how many people would say, yes, I would agree with that. Josefina says, I'm Hispanic and I do not agree with this stupidity. I find that Hispanics and Latinos very rarely do agree with this stupidity. Mimi says, no, I see whiteness in guys like this and scored it. Yep, I think that's pretty accurate. Oh, now I feel stupid. Someone explained to me that it was like Mistopheles, like the... Okay, someone's gonna have to explain to me how to pronounce that guy's name. I don't even know. I don't even know anymore. Anthony says, as a Mexican American, I do not. Yeah, exactly.
And I had one other piece, but I'll end here because I've been talking a little bit too long. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, just thought there was a transition, but I'll just jump right in. Sorry about that. Good afternoon again, everyone. This is going to be perhaps a bit of an experiment. When I'm speaking to groups, I tend to prefer taking on more of a conversational effect. Even in a room of 100 people, I find it's possible when you can see people, respond to their faces, look them in the eye. I think there's something that can be achieved in terms of a conversation. It's a little more challenging with technology, but we're going to give it a go. First is whenever I'm talking, a lot of times when I'm listening to other presenters and reflecting in the moment, things come up. And on this divide that Paul spoke so well to, the idea of there being something around blackness and whiteness that is a fiction, most of it from a biological standpoint, but it's very real from other perspectives. And one thing that's always struck me as I've moved through life is how there's this awareness, I would say a much greater awareness among folks of color, particularly Black folks, because we live the oppression and discrimination on a daily basis. We're acutely uber aware of it. And oftentimes many white folks are not. And so there's this whole conversation that happens within the Black community. So I was thinking of some terms I can remember from my youth, this idea of quiet as it's kept. So quiet as it's kept is there are things that we will discuss within the Black community that we won't necessarily discuss publicly. And then it moved to me to some things that are kind of tongue-in-cheek axioms or adages within the Black community that interestingly really just came up to, for me or reemerged for me today thinking about this. One is, my sister and I often do this, but it's a Black folks thing. When you see something where where a Black person does something that is less than ideal, socially inappropriate, problematic, I'll call my sister and will race to be the first one to tell the other person, that's your people. And we're teasing and we're associating, but it strikes me there's nothing like that in the white community. When a white person acts, there's not this sense that that person is somehow acting for the group and impacting.
I'm sorry, what? We just spent a half an hour talking about how race is a social construct and all whites are bad and racist, and now this guy is saying that, like, there's not an assumption made that when a white person does something, they're acting for the group? Okay.
The perception of the group and how the group moves through life is just individual. Bill does whatever.
Dude, guess what? You are an individual too. I don't judge all Black people based on what you say and do.
Susie does whatever, and it just is. But oftentimes, when a Black person acts, it speaks for the whole community, particularly when it's on the negatively perceived side of action, as opposed to the.
Aren't these the same people who just a few minutes ago were making the argument that the police were started based on being like a slave force or something like that? Wasn't that the argument that they were making? Please.
Positive. And then the last one that I thought of is when I was young, I can remember you'd be talking with someone, and when someone put themselves above others, they were judgmental, critical, or took a holier than thou position. Oftentimes one would say, that's mighty white of you, to sort of put them down or point out to them that they were being pompous. And I thought, once again, that's an interesting thing. And it speaks to, I think, what we just heard.
Well, if you're saying that that's mighty white of you, that certainly sounds like you're making broad generalizations about an entire race instead of treating people like individuals. I'm just saying.
About power, dynamics, etc. So I thought I might just start off with that. So another thing I thought it was interesting to end with the idea of his awareness of his whiteness. And once you have awareness, you no longer have a ability to be innocent. But I think we have an overall problem.
Once you are aware of your whiteness, you are not innocent of your whiteness. You have to work every single day to deconstruct your whiteness. Otherwise, you are a racist.
In dealing with this issue, in that we really don't have a lot of subjective understanding of what it means to be white. And by saying,
I thought we just said that white people were treated as individuals and not as a group. So why if every white person was treated as individuals, why would there be any reason to have an understanding of the collective of whiteness? Brent says, this sounds more like projection because non-whites judge other non-whites. All whites must do the same. I mean, frankly, I would much prefer to live in a world where we all just look at each other as individuals. That would be my preference, regardless of race.
And I'm saying that I think it's generally accepted that we look to the people who are experiencing something to tell us about that experience. and that there's something limited, even illegitimate, about an outsider talking about someone else's subjective experience.
If there is something limiting about an outsider talking about someone else's subjective experience, then why are you talking about whiteness? And again, I actually don't actually believe that. I'm not making that argument at all, but I'm using his argument to try to, like, why are you talking about whiteness if we can't talk about someone else's experience? Why are you leading that conversation? The other dude would have been more appropriate based on your philosophy.
But what we have is folks of color have thought about and experienced whiteness all the time, and we have no shortage of opinions about what it is. But to the degree that so many whites are just in the process of becoming more woke, more aware.
Okay, so is he making the argument that well, I'm going to say black people because I'm not going to say people of color. Like, is he making the argument that black people understand whiteness more than white people do? I think that's what he's saying.
About the status of whiteness, we don't have a lot of people moving around talking about what it means to be inside of that identity, because so much has been done to make that identity normative and invisible. So people just go through life saying, I am what I am, I work at this place, I have this family, but they're not giving us or even having their own subjective understanding of that identity. And I think that is another thing that challenges us.
Do you really think that being a white person in Vermont is the same as being a white person in Chicago, is the same as being a white person in Alabama? Like, those are going to be completely different experiences. Why would we make, I mean, and the same for anyone too. I mean, the same for anyone living in these different areas. I mean, where you, like, the type of environment you live in is going to dictate much more about your experience than your skin color.
So quickly, when I thought about this, I think there are a couple things that make it challenging for us to move through this at the individual human level. And I think that part of that's human psychology, that for me, the 400 plus years of oppression and persecution, murder, etc., is ultimately about fear and anxiety. And it's almost like the perfect setup, the perfect crime was this creation of this white-black dynamic, so that it is insidious and it just perpetuates itself. And therefore, it's become this thing that has a sort of presence all its own. But I think at its base, oftentimes it's about fear and anxiety. And blackness has been set up as the ultimate boogeyman. When you're in a tough spot, and I'll come back to that, we can see what happens in some of the things that are playing out in interpersonal reactions. But when you're in this fear, back against the wall, tough spot, and blackness is available to you to strike out as and to present as the problem, oftentimes white folks will do that because it's ever available to do so. But I think it's helpful to remember.
Did he just say that white people just scapegoat black people because it's the easiest scapegoat they have? Am I paraphrasing that correctly? I'm pretty sure that's what he just said.
That in many ways it is a fear anxiety response that just has a readily available.
As a fear or anxiety? No. That's not how that works, dude. Our sympathetic nervous system dictates our flight and fight response. Fight or flight fundamentally means we are going to, like, run away from something and not try to address it or fight it aggressively. Now, I can't control that there might be a scenario in which some white person might lash out at some black person when they are legitimately in fear of their life. That certainly could occur, but they're going to lash out at whoever is in front of them. That's how fight or flight works. It's whoever is in front of them. If that person that's in front of them happens to be black, guess what? That's not a reflection of the freaking race in 99% of occurrences. It's simply a reflection of the fact that you trigger their survival mechanism. What did you do to trigger their survival mechanism in the flipping first place? Anthony says, I have a puzzle for this guy. I am Hispanic with a white girlfriend. Ooh, Anthony. Oh, getting with the oppressor, man. According to their math, her whiteness oppresses me, yet I am a man, I oppress her. So who is the oppressor here? I think that's a very, very, very good question, Anthony.
Available something to help alleviate that sense of fear.
An even better question to ask is like, if you and your girlfriend eventually get married and have kids, are your kids going to be white or are they going to be biracial? And should they identify with the white part of themselves when the white part of themselves is the oppressor?
I read a book. I don't know how many people just share good books. There was a book back in the late 90s, I think, called All Souls Day. And it was a white gentleman who grew up in South Boston. And what I think it articulated really well is the fact that if you know Boston geography, you've got South Boston, which is pretty much pressed up against Roxbury, not far from Dorchester. So two of the blackest and brownest neighborhoods in Boston being Dorchester and Roxbury, and Southie right next to it. And many of the circumstances in all three of those communities in the 70s and 80s, where you had breakdown of manufacturing and other ways of people making money and supporting a family and other dynamics, made it so that the poverty, the crime, the drug use, the family breakdown.
Those areas that he's talking about are actually pretty effing gentrified right now. They've all been gentrified, all of them. And Boston's pretty much closed down now. It's actually really, really sad. I was seeing pictures from Boston just the other day. It's like everything downtown is just shut down. It's so incredibly sad. Boston is the greatest city in the world. I love it there so much, and I'm really upset about what's happened to it, actually.
Yeah, we're pretty similar across all three communities. But this gentleman, in a way that was almost made him out to be a traitor, he pointed out that his belief that one of the reasons South Boston suffered so terribly, and in the 90s there was a horrible suicide and opiate addiction epidemic, and was that what white South Bostoners told themselves, their narrative is that we can't have those problems because those are the problems that black and brown people have.
I'm sorry. I live in New Hampshire where we have one of the worst opioid problems in the damn country, and New Hampshire is mostly white. So I don't know where that comes from.
And therefore, they couldn't own the problems, they couldn't address the problems, and the community at some level was literally imploding, crumbling from the inside because it had these toxins, this cancer in its midst, and it couldn't address it because of the narrative that it told itself.
I don't know all the ins and outs of this particular narrative, but I do not buy what he's saying at all. Not one stretch of the imagination. Absolutely not. There, like, of course, like, listen, like, let's not front. There were issues in South Boston. There absolutely were, but it's a city. Like, that's what happens in areas that it's mostly based on like socioeconomic status. It's not about race. And I strongly doubt that those issues were not addressed because of race. I strongly doubt that.
And I was just really impressed by that book to help understand more of the history and how deep these narratives are of who we are and how they impede us in our movement.
Yeah, okay, like people from I fucking dated a guy from Southie in college. Like, I mean, people from South Boston are badass, tough people. I do not buy this guy's interpretation of this, and not one stretch of the imagination.
Now, what I'm interested in mostly in this conversation and everything moving forward is how do we go forward? How do we improve the situation? And I think that what that's going to require, which is going to be difficult, is a certain amount of empathy and compassion. It's going to be both ways. It's going to be from those of us who've suffered for years and years, BIPOC folks, but also it's going to take that from white folks to themselves. You'll often hear folks of color.
White folks just need to have empathy and compassion for the poor, suffering BIPOCs, which he doesn't actually mean BIPOC, he means black. That's what he's actually really talking about. Not any of the other non-white people, just black.
Say the last thing we need is guilt or pity or self-flagellation. Those just aren't very productive. They don't change things very much. They don't move us forward. And at the end of the day, they're very self-centered. It's about oneself, right? That those feelings are really about how I feel about me, and they end up being ultimately very self-centered, even if they're coming from a place of feeling badly. So just some things that I think. One is the individual versus the collective. I have empathy for the fact that if you're the individual, working poor, working class white person who's struggling on a daily basis to put food on the table, take care of your family, just move through life. I can't imagine that always feels like a very privileged position.
Hang on. There's a question in the chat. What the hell is a BIPOC? BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
And you can even look around you and see folks of color who, certainly on the surface, the car they drive, the job they have, the house they have, appear to have a great deal more privilege than you. And if you're that person who has not had the education, has not been part of the conversations about the history, etc., I can see it being difficult to be pointed at as a racist, as the problem, and as someone who's keeping people down when that doesn't feel, you don't have a palpable sense of that experience.
Okay, so what he's just said is that I just want to reiterate, because he's about to say but. As soon as I unpause this video, he's going to go, but XYZ. So what he just said is that it can be really hard for a poor white person to accept their inherent racism because it doesn't really feel like you have privilege. And now what he's going to do is he's going to explain, but here's why you do have privilege as a poor white person over a rich Black person.
And so I think the ability to understand in our national conversation about this, that we're talking about systems, we're talking about collectives, we're talking about group dynamics.
It's not about you as the individual poor white person. It is about the system of whiteness, of which you are an active and willing participant because you were born white.
Is the place where racism, the power dynamic, really plays out. And oftentimes the individual to individual interaction can look a lot different. And the dynamics that play out interpersonally can feel different. Certainly, folks of color can be discriminatory and biased and prejudiced as much as anyone else. But it's really difficult in this country, I would argue impossible, for any group of folks of color to systematically deny access and impose power on white folks in a way that impedes something about how they move through life, job, food security, housing, etc. And so that distinction is, I think, something we need to make and help people understand that, because I think the conversation will go that much better. I also think it's important to not, I think we sometimes specifically demonize, we act like whiteness and the ills that are perpetrated on whiteness are some specific set of human behaviors. I personally don't believe that. I think they are contextualized and historically created, as we learned earlier, just like the Nazis. I don't think Nazi Germans were a different sort.
I'm sorry, what? Let's listen to that again. I'm just going to back that up about 30 seconds.
Something about how they move through life, job, food security, housing, etc. And so that distinction is, I think, some.
Just watch for the part where he compares being white to being a Nazi.
We need to make help people understand that, because I think the conversation will go that much better. I also think it's important to not, I think we sometimes specifically demonize, we act like whiteness and the ills that are perpetrated on whiteness are some specific set of human behaviors. I personally don't believe that. I think they are contextualized and historically created, as we learned earlier, just like the Nazis. I don't think Nazi Germans were a different sort of human being.
Nazis weren't different human beings. They were just contextualized manifestations of their time.
They were human beings that had certain circumstances. They had a leader who was an incredible manipulator, and horrific things happened.
He's going to compare him to Trump. He's going to compare him to Trump. Watch, he's going to compare him to Trump.
And under some of those human beings, but I would be very careful to be another human being looking at that and accepting myself, thinking that myself or another group of humans might not fall prey to similar circumstances and behave in really problematic ways. I think history tells us that, unfortunately.
He's literally just compared being white to being a Nazi. And GC says, I'd rather not get called a Nazi while crocheting. Touche. Wow.
All of us as humans can be pretty base and behave in problematic ways. So I think we need to avoid essentializing these characteristics.
You think?
Next, I just want to point out what I believe in our current moment is a particularly helpful example to look at to understand some of what's happening in this white.
So Black Magic says, if we're going to divide people, why stop here? Why not compare disparities between Scandos and Irish descents, Russians and Lithuanians, French and Algo, Prodi and Baptist? I don't know what those are, but okay, what about you? Again, we have to keep in mind that none of those categories matter because in the land of anti-racism, literally every single one that you just mentioned has ascended to whiteness. Let's see. Brent, thank you again. We're going to demonize a certain group of people, label it, but can't describe what they do. Well, he's also, I mean, he's contradicted himself there, right? Because he said that white people don't have a white culture, so they're not even self-aware that they're white anyway, so they just think they're the norm, and they don't even know what they do, they don't know what their culture is. And then he also says, well, Black people know what whiteness is. Black people can define whiteness. Black people are in a better position to assess what whiteness is than white people. I mean, he's contradicted himself so many times. He really, like, I get the whole idea of like just having a conversation with people, but he really needs to go back and strengthen his talking points. I don't know if he's doing it off the cuff or if he has notes, but it's like I'm finding him very hard to follow. I don't really know what points he's trying to make other than the one that stood out, which is he compared being white to being a Nazi, which I want to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I want to be fair. I don't think that was his actual intent, but that's definitely how it came out. Now, I would not be surprised to have a conversation with him to say, did you understand that when you said this and this, you compared being white to being a Nazi? That probably wasn't his intent. I do want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure many people in the chat will not be too keen on giving him the benefit of the doubt. But, you know, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't think he meant that. I think he's kind of speaking off the cuff and probably should have just prepared his talking points a little bit better.
Blackness or whiteness versus BIPOC reality in a way that might be more instructive and a little bit easier to pick apart. And that is rather than looking at something which is all too common, very sensational, horrific, like George Floyd's murder before us in 8+ minutes. There's so many of the tropes and ways we have of thinking about this problem that are present in that I believe can distract us from some of the underlying issues we want to look at. So instead of looking at a circumstance like that, I've been growing more interested in what happened between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park.
Oh, God.
In the Ramble section of the park where Christian...
Okay, so Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, if you recall, it was the black guy walking his dog and the white lady the white lady was walking her dog and the black guy walking by, and the white lady freaked out and almost choked her dog with the leash and called the cops, and it was really bad, and she was, not behaving the way she should have either. Both of them were being a little too beyond the pale for my taste, but that's what he's talking about.
Cooper asked Amy to put her dog on a leash, as all signs indicated one should do. She reacted defensively immediately. He very calmly started filming it, thinking this could be a situation that might benefit from being captured and recorded. And she then proceeded to escalate to the point where she called the police, was very specific about him being a problem because he's an African-American male, claiming she was being assaulted, and really creating quite a scene.
I think that everyone can agree that what Amy Cooper did was stupid. It was stupid.
Handling her dog in a way that was rough and problematic. And why I think that's interesting is, and I've heard some people give some data that there's not much evidence that Amy Cooper was a virulent racist. She didn't have much past of attending white supremacy rallies. She didn't have blogs where she spewed racist thoughts. My sense is she was fairly run-of-the-mill New York upper middle class white woman. She found herself in a tight position, per my earlier comments. She was anxious. At some level, she was very defensive. She knew she was wrong. She knew the dog should be on a leash. She didn't want to be called out. She certainly didn't want to be called out by a black man. And then I think without her really having much conscious thought about it, she went to the deep, dark place of race and thought she could use that to get protection. She was certain that if the
And she experienced pretty severe consequences for doing that. She even lost that dog. She lost her job. And listen, like I I have mixed feelings on the whole thing. I didn't like the way she treated the dog. I didn't like that she reacted the way she did. She shouldn't have called the cops. She shouldn't have threatened him. People in the chat are pointing out, and I think it's a fair criticism, that he also kind of threatened her when he really like had a treat for the dog in his pocket or something, and kind of threatened her. And I could understand why she may have misinterpreted it, but I don't think that that actually excuses her poor behavior. And she threatened constantly, like she experienced consequences for the whole thing, which is how it should work. Now, do I think that she should be vilified forever and never be able to get a job again? No, I think that there should be a path to redemption. But to say that she did this and didn't experience consequences is just not true.
the police came, they didn't show up during the time those two were there. But I think she was certain that if they did come, they would have come to her aid. And in the process, she really upended her life. She lost a very well-paying job. She had to get rid of her dog. She got death threats, pretty high consequences for being unconscious about this thing that rested inside of her, this animus towards Black folks and the way it could emerge. So I present that to people. I encourage people to go back and look at that situation, because I think it was really, I think Krista mentioned the idea of a mirror. I think it was a mirror for Amy Cooper. She, what Christian Cooper did by putting up that camera and staying there pretty placidly, unintimidated, and just allowing her to go off on her own. She was really looking in a mirror at some ugliness that resided in her that she was not aware of. So I want to close out because I really think the question.
Wait, so you're making the assumption that because one woman had I mean, frankly, like, I think that a lot of like lefty women are, and frankly men too, I think that a lot of them are racist. I think that I've made that argument pretty clear. When you're fundamentally saying that you believe that whites are the normalized race and that everyone else is like abnormal, that's a racist idea. I think a lot of people on the left hold very racist ideas. But to say that Amy Cooper is representative of all white people, doesn't that go against the argument that he was making at the very flipping beginning? Didn't he start his section by saying that when white people do something, they don't pick out another white person and say you are representative of all white people. When Black people do something, you do pick out that person and say they are representative of all Black people. Well, isn't he just contradicting himself here? Because he's literally holding Amy Cooper, one person, up as an example of what all white people do.
Question and answer period is important. And just offer, I'm pretty sure it's been something that's dealt with at UVM. I know I encountered it at Champlain College. And I think that is that we need to.
Fun fact, I used to teach at Champlain College. Fun fact.
Move through this work that we're doing as a nation here, as UVM, as a community of Burlington, et cetera, in an appreciative inquiry way. I think the more we can take into account the fact that we're dealing with human psychology, it happens to be around this most sensitive and difficult issue. But I think the reason appreciative inquiry took hold is that an approach that isn't punitive, that isn't finger pointing, that isn't constantly critical, that isn't judgmental, and isn't causing people to feel badly all the time, just has better outcomes when you're dealing with humans. And so as hard as it is, I think we need to try to adopt that sort of perspective, trying to move through in a way that is generative, that moves us forward. It doesn't mean we can't point out that which is problematic, but adopt a sort of constructive criticism perspective so we look at it in ways that allow us to move forward. So with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you, Paul, as well, for both of your presentations. What we'd like to do now is shift into our Q&A session. I know we have some questions coming in, so we'll start to answer those. If you have more questions, comments, please put those into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. And it looks like the first question is for Paul. So Paul, if you would like to read the question and answer, that would be great.
We're going to find out if they pre-wrote these questions. I think that they did.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it in the, we've gone down below it now in the chat. Let's see where it is. I'm sorry. Here.
Can I just say, I genuinely feel sorry for guys like this. I really, really do. Because, like, I look at this guy, I view a guy that, like, he's probably a really nice guy. He probably means well. He probably, picked this stuff up along the way. He thinks this is what he needs to do to be a good person. Like, I saw a TikTok video the other day of a white guy that was like not too dissimilar to this guy right here, and he was like confessing that he was a racist, and it broke my heart. Honest to God, it broke my heart, because it's just so sad that these guys have been taught to hate themselves. They've been taught to hate themselves and who they are, and it's just, I don't think that they're fundamentally bad people. I just think that they've been indoctrinated into some really, really crazy ideas. And I think that, I see people in the chat pushing back on me. No, I'm going to stand my ground on this one. I think that having kindness and empathy means that you have it for everyone. I'm not going to be selective about this. I have empathy for people who are put in positions of being brainwashed into this nonsense, because it's not, this is not going to help them live their best life. And I just feel really bad for them. I really do.
So there's two questions that I came across. One is, given the complexity of what is involved in both the construct of whiteness and also what is more commonly becoming referred to as white supremacy culture, what do these presenters, and I think this is for both of us.
Whiteness is now being referred to as white supremacy culture.
I think the most important question to ask right now is, where do we start right now if you want to truly address equity? So it's a very complicated question, and there's not a simple answer to it. But we are in a revolution.
Yeah, so Black Magic, I agree with you that their empathy is the prejudice of low expectations. I 100% agree with that. When I use the word empathy and kindness, I'm not using it in the same way as them. When I use it, what I mean is that I want to see I see a human being that is flawed, but is no less worthy of love, is no less worthy of self-esteem, is no less worthy of a positive self-image. Like, that's what I mean. I want to see everyone feel good about themselves. I want to see everyone achieve whatever they want in this world, regardless of whether I personally like them or not. Because in my belief system, I believe, like, I'm you, you're me, right? I should want for you what I want for myself. I don't want to see this guy like go through what remains of his life feeling like he is a bad person because he was born white. That to me is horrible. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
Revolutionary moment, I think, right now. There's some amazing things that are happening. A lot of the work that's been done over the past 20 or 25 years all over the country, I think, is coming to fruition. There's more people talking about these issues, more people wanting to learn and act around these issues. The New York Times bestseller list, I think 14 out of the 15 combined paperback and ebooks are books that we've been using and talking about for a long time. So,
by the way, I think I'm going to start reading How to Be an Anti-Racist this week. So if you want, make sure you're following me on Twitter and Parler, and I'll be picking apart that book. I have the ebook of it. So I might be doing that one at some point this week. Speaking of best-selling trash that no one should be forced to read except people like me who are insane and a glutton for punishment.
One of the questions that comes up for me around this is, where's this going to go? And we talk about the possessive investment in whiteness and the psychological investment in whiteness. Are white people going to stay in this? Or is it going to be a couple months and then back to normal? That's an important question for me. But the other answer that I want to give is, I think that and as Wanda alluded to earlier, that we have to start doing this work. We have to be willing to do this work ourselves. When I first got into this work, I realized that there was a whole lot I didn't know. And in fact, it's interesting. And Robin DiAngelo talks about this. He said, I've never met a
ding,
white
ding.
person who doesn't have opinions about race and racism, right?
Robin DiAngelo is also an admitted racist in her own damn book.
But and it was very clear to me. My colleague Patty DeRosa says that a lot of people have opinions about racism, but very few people know much about it. And so part of the questions we need to be asking is, what's the work that we need to do? And for those of us that are white, we can do everything I learned about race and racism, I either learned from BIPOC people or from people who learned it from them. However, I don't have to have them there to bleed for me to understand this. There's all kinds of ways that I can do this work. And the other important thing is the work isn't just for my own self-improvement. That work has to be tied to finding ways to take action. And we have
what a lot of times they mean by take action is essentially apply this critical theory bullshit to everything and call out everything as racist. That's what they mean by action. Robin DiAngelo talks about this in White Fragility. I'm sure Ibram X. Kendi talks about it in How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I will be reading this week, probably.
A saying that we use, and that is that choice is a function of expanded awareness. And the more we start looking at this, the more we start looking at ourselves, the more we start understanding the history, the more we start understanding the system, it gives us more options and more opportunities to be taking action. And that action has to be done for those of us that are white. A lot of work to be done with our own people, our own families, our own places of work. We need to be stepping up. But the other piece, it needs to also be done following the leadership of people of color and in multiracial coalitions and collaborations.
Yeah, so what is the work? They never quite say. They never quite say what the work is. It's educating yourself, it's reading books, it's watching the movies that they want you to watch, it's doing webinars like this, I guess. They never quite define what doing the work is or what the goal is. But ultimately, if we're thinking about how they're defining things, so systemic racism, the goal is to dismantle systemic racism, right? Well, systemic racism fundamentally is every system, including UVM. UVM is going to be part of the system. Every organization that you guys work for excuse me, is part of the system. So the goal is to dismantle all of these systems, right? Well, we'll take it a step further. What supports the system? If we look at a book like In Defense of Looting is all about how property rights are systemic racism. And so therefore people looting during riots or really just stealing other people's stuff is completely okay because that's fighting back against systemic racism. So what this ultimately all ends up leading to, if you keep walking it back and back and back and back and back, is we get to socialism and communism and the collective. That's what it ultimately ends up leading to. They're trying to kill off the individual in favor of looking at people like these archetypes and the system as these oppressive things that we need to fundamentally rip down to the core and rebuild in the image of Mao, probably. I don't know.
Do you want me to? I'll stop there.
Hello, I'm going to answer a question. Let me read it to folks first. Question: what do you think about the importance of reparations, and what role do you think institutions and individuals beyond just our federal government have to play? I think that question, certainly for me, connects to the prior question about the complexities involved in this topic and in our current moment. It's an incredibly complex time, and I would say that reparations is an incredibly complex issue. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but it does occur to me that as we move forward, so much of the difficulty, the pain, the suffering happen in sort of the affective realm, the interpersonal realm, the psychological realm, but so much of the ability to address things will happen in the political realm. And that's a very different place. And it does not strike me that we can single-handedly or unilaterally change the laws of politics because we're dealing with this issue. We have people, we have government, we have voting, we have things that there are vetoes and ways that people can resist if the movement does not happen in a politically savvy and strategic way. So I think that with reparations, there has to be a lot of thought. On the one hand, on the former idea I said, I think it's unassailable. Certainly for all the things, much of which Paul outlined for us, some issue of repairing is morally necessary, financially necessary, socially necessary, historically necessary. That's on the justice side. But I think one of many examples of the fact that sometimes in the political realm, the justice that is warranted is not received is South Africa. Truth and Reconciliation was a really
Why are we talking about South Africa? Where the hell did South Africa come from?
tough political compromise. And so I hope it doesn't feel like I'm dodging the question, because I certainly think the idea of repair is necessary, but doing the repair in a strategic way is important. Now, one thing that I think is part of this is what is the larger thing, and that is white folks understanding that this is white folks' issue. So white folks, I don't think, should think about it as repairing.
So then why are you even presenting in this webinar if it is white folks' issue to fix?
Something for folks of color. It should be thought of as repairing the nation, repairing our collective soul and psyche. This is a bane on all of our existences. It impedes our growth and impedes our ever coming close to realizing the incredible dream of our American democracy. So that sort of shift might be helpful, move to an investment, because there will be change, and that change, if something about reparations were to happen, will take resources from one place and redistribute them. Now, whether that redistribution is thought of as loss and something taken away, or thought of more like, I hope most of us think of our parenting, it is an investment. Parenting is ludicrously expensive, as someone with 3 children in college can attest to. But I think we think of those things as an investment that's positive and forward moving. I think we could think of reparations in the same way.
Yeah, I think Melissa actually makes a really good point here. She says it's white people's responsibility because racists don't think blacks have the ability to do so. I completely agree with you. Now, I want to say that, and if you guys have watched some of my videos on this topic, this is my stance on things. I actually I'm not opposed to the idea of reparations. I actually do take Marianne Williamson's. I know that this is, can't believe these words coming out of my mouth. I agree with Marianne Williamson in that I believe that it's payment for a debt owed. I appreciate that on a spiritual level. I don't ever want to see reparations in the form, though, of cash payments out to individuals. I don't think that makes sense. I do think investing money in things that are going to uplift previously underserved communities and actually have a chance of being effective at presenting more opportunity could easily be branded as reparations. And frankly, I think that Donald Trump really missed an opportunity in terms of his opportunity zones in places like Baltimore. I think he really missed an opportunity to brand opportunity zones as reparations. I think he absolutely could have. He could have branded his permanent funding of historically black colleges and universities as reparations. This is a branding exercise. It's about marketing. It's about positioning. That's what it is. And at the same time, you're helping people, and at the same time, you're lifting people up. I think that is actually a good thing overall. I'm not opposed to it. And now you guys will all scream at me in the chat. I don't really care. I don't really care. You're like, no, Carolyn, no reparations for people who are dead. We didn't do anything. Well, guess what, guys? When you lift up underserved communities, when you create more opportunity for them, a rising tide lifts all boats, motherfuckers. A rising tide lifts all boats.
Paul, don't forget to go off mute.
Sorry. There's a question that came up about Vermont, and the question is, where does Vermont fit into this concept of whiteness? Are we in a bubble?
Oh.
I want to say a few things. Going back to what Kyle was just saying, I think for me, if those of us that are white don't understand that we have self-interest in this, then I don't know where we go. There's a wonderful saying attributed to an Aboriginal woman that basically said, if you want to come and work with me to help me, so be it. Don't worry about it. But if you want to come, I'm paraphrasing here, but if you want to come because you understand that your liberation is deeply entwined with mine, then let us work together. And the reality is, when we look at the system of white supremacy, it is actually destroying the planet. And so we.
Yeah, Lady Della, I'm not advocating for giving them money. In fact, I literally said I'm not in favor of direct cash payments. I don't know why people even bother being on my live streams if you're not actually going to listen to what I'm saying. Honestly, like I've run into this over and over and over again. Every time I've talked about this issue, I have never once said direct cash payments. What I have said is investments in programs that are going to lift everyone up. That's exactly what I said, dude.
We need to really take that in. In terms of Vermont, I first want to say that, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier. When we talk about, we've asked probably well over 10,000 people over the last number of years how they understand race and racism, and the vast majority of people, and particularly white people, but not only white people, have an understanding of racism, a conceptual understanding is happening on that internal interpersonal dimension. They see racism as something that people, oftentimes they might say prejudice and discrimination based on race, but they see it's what we think and what we do, as opposed to a systemic structural analysis that we've been talking to. And those two understandings have profound meaning in terms of the way you think about and see the world.
It's like I never said that reparations are an exercise in branding and marketing and naming something that helps people and calling it reparations. It's like I never said it was a branding exercise. Jesus Christ.
World. If you think that racism is individual and internal, and somebody starts using the,
Donald Trump would have been genius for branding some of his initiatives as reparations. Donald Trump had quite a record to run on for the African-American community. The fact that he didn't brand it as reparations was a really big goddamn missed opportunity. And the fact that his platinum plan that he proposed as part of his campaign wasn't branded as reparations was a really missed opportunity. That's what it is. It's positioning. It's marketing.
So say you did something racist, think about how you're going to take that. But if you understand that you're operating in this system, and in fact, how could you not be doing and saying and thinking things that are racist? It's a whole different reaction, and we see that playing out all the time.
Yes, I do think things are happening, and I think they should be branded and marketed as reparations.
In public conversations, when people are using those terms and they think they're talking about the same thing, they're not, and they don't understand each other. So when we come to Vermont, the reality is that Vermont is part of the system that we're operating.
I know I'm now just ignoring the webinar and fighting with you guys, but if you guys are like triggered by the word reparations, then you're a bunch of fucking snowflakes. It's a word.
In this nation. Systemic racism happens, it's nested, it's like a fractal. It happens at every institution we function in, it happens in every community we function in, it happens in every county, every state, it happens throughout the country. So we're all swimming in that. And in fact, one thing, if you talk to pretty much any person of color, by POC person in Vermont, they will say that we're not living in a bubble around these issues. That's the reality. But when we think about this institutionally, we think about our education system, what's being taught, who determines what's taught, who's teaching it. When we think about our healthcare system, when we think about the racial disparities in incarceration in Vermont, all of those things are playing out. We're swimming in.
See, and here's where the snowflakes on the right come out. It's not just a word. Reparations are not just a word. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Facts don't care about your feelings. Words are not violence. It's just a word.
This system, systemic racism is operating in Vermont, and it's operating very well. Vermont isn't the whitest or the second whitest state in the nation by accident, right? There's a history that leads to it. It's not because Black people and other people of color don't like the cold, right? And so I think we need to understand that we're.
Wait. Is he arguing that Vermont is the whitest state in the country because of racism, then why do you live there, dude? If you're doing the work to fight your inherent white supremacy. I'm sorry, I've switched from arguing with the chat to watching the webinar now. Then why do you live in Vermont? Then why? Well, Vermont is not the whitest state in the country by accident. It is racism. Joy Buzzer says the wealthy elite turn to the conversation to whiteness because they don't want it to be about wealthiness. I completely agree. I completely agree with you. And then let's see. Rhett, thank you for the super chat. I agree with you. Individual cash payments, no. Helping African Americans through strengthening institutions, like, for example, education assistance, is a very good idea and will help address injustices of the past. See, that's all I'm saying, man. That's all I'm saying. Like, I like that. I like opportunity zones. I like investing in, and I really think it's more about socioeconomic status than it is about race necessarily. But at the same time, I think we can also acknowledge that, you know, fundamentally, if you're addressing things based on socio and economic status, that's going to hit the Black community. It is, because that's just the way it is, and it's sad, and it shouldn't be that way. But it is the way it is, and I think that a lot of people would benefit from it if it was done right.
That we're not living in a bubble, and we also, based on the reality of our demographics, we need to see what does anti-racism work look like in predominantly white spaces. What's the work that white people need to do in vastly majority white spaces? And I think that's an important piece, because another one of my favorite Tim Wise pieces is he talks about, he said that many white people say that, or a lot of white people say they have many, quote unquote, many Black friends. And he says, well, many is more than a couple. And so he said, if that's the reality, and given our demographics, then Black people must be going to an awful lot of cookouts, right? They must be all they're doing is like hanging out with us. And so, there's this reality that we're.
Did he just make the argument that the only place that white people hang out with Black people is at cookouts? Okay.
We're living in, and the system of racism is impacting us all here in Lily White, Vermont, in the deep north.
I'm so confused about. Okay, I'm just gonna rewind. I'm just so confused about what he just said. Okay, hang on. I'm just gonna rewind a little bit.
An important piece, because another one of my favorite Tim Wise pieces is he talks about, he said that many white people say that, or a lot of white people say they have many, quote unquote, many Black friends. And he says, well, many is more than a couple. And so he said, if that's the reality, and given our demographics, then Black people must be going to an awful lot of cookouts, right? They must be all they're doing is like hanging out with us. And so, there's this reality that we're living in, and the system of racism is impacting us all here in Lily White, Vermont, in the deep north.
Okay. I just want to quickly, because I think it's interesting, connected to Paul's question of the whiteness of our state and what that does to us in terms of how we address this issue. I was with a friend going through a neighborhood and pointing out that the neighborhood was a beautiful neighborhood, a pretty neighborhood, a place that for many reasons you could see someone wanting to live there. And I was lamenting that I always feel torn in neighborhoods like that, thinking that if tomorrow 10 Black families could move into the neighborhood, our history would suggest some number of the white families would move out. And this person I was with,
he's literally just making things up now. Just because things have happened in the past doesn't actually mean it's going to bear any resemblance to what's happened now. And I find it hard to believe that if 10 Black families moved into Burlington, Vermont, that the white folk would just be like hightailing it out of there to go to the Northeast Kingdom to live with that other guy.
Was kind of shocked and hurt by that idea and was very defensive. Did not believe that to be true.
So provide data to back up your point, dude. Provide data to prove that it's true, because what he's going to do is he's going to tell you a story and make it seem like the white person was irrationally offended by it. Provide data.
And then they pointed out specific houses where they knew the people and said, that's not true for that family, not true for that family, not true for that family. So I kind of stepped back and I said, it's interesting the vehemence with which you're defending, when I'm curious on what grounds do you.
It's interesting the vehemence with which you're defending. So now what he's going to do is he's going to expect the white person to give him data to prove their point when he has not actually done the same in return.
You know that. Just that
How do
they're
you know
progressive people who talk in a way that seems like they wouldn't do it. I would imagine, or I'm going to guess, that none of them has ever lived in a black neighborhood. Few of them have close black contact. So
he doesn't know that. You don't know that. He literally does not know that unless he knows specifically who they're talking about and all their personal history. He does not know that.
Easy to say they wouldn't do it when we have no idea.
You're right. You have no idea. So why are you making an assumption about what they would do either way? You have no idea.
Because that family's never been presented, and it's not so much to demonize them and say it's definitely true.
Yeah, so Black Magic says, I need to point out Vermont was the first state in the Union to abolish slavery and give every male a vote. Vermont was also the first state to pass civil unions back when I was in my first year of college, actually. So that was much later than abolishing slavery, actually. But I mean, this is a fair point. So if Vermont is the first state to abolish slavery, then that other guy was making the argument that it's fundamentally racist because most of the people who live there are white. Those two things don't seem to coincide.
But I was interested and wanted to interrogate why this friend of mine needed to go to bat for these people
because you're fundamentally assuming the worst of them. You're literally fundamentally assuming the worst of her neighbors when you have no data to back it up, but you're expecting her to provide data to prove you wrong.
The appropriate answer would have been,
you should be coming with data to prove yourself right.
I just don't know. I wish that weren't true, but I don't know. But there was strong conviction about it not being true. And I wanted that individual to think about where that came from and what their need was to address that. So once again, the question, do you think that there is any value to segregating students by racial identity within our UVM diversity courses? Are there ways that we...
Okay, hang on. I'm going to rewind. We're going to play this question again because I am genuinely shocked at this question and I'm going to be really interested in the answer. This person is asking if there is value in racially segregating students at the University of Vermont. Let's just rewind just a touch. Just a touch.
That individual think about where that came from and what their need was to address that. So once again, the question, do you think that there is any value to segregating students by racial identity within our UVM diversity courses? Are there ways that we can support our BIPOC students or student employees without hitting them over the heads with our performative anti-racist work? So to take the question straight on, yes, I do.
He just said there is value to segregating students by their racial identity for their coursework. It's like the Civil Rights Act never happened. They can't do that, by the way.
I do think there's some value in segregating students, but that value, I would argue, is not without cost. So the challenge we have, which we keep coming, I think, back to it again and again, is the...
I mean, if I was like a reasonable person and I was asked, is there value in segregation? My answer would be an emphatic no. No, there is not value in segregation, and let me explain why. We went through a whole bunch of movements, of civil rights movements, to get rid of segregation in this country. We passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The University of Vermont is not allowed to segregate students. It is a public university. Not allowed. Oh my God.
Complexity and the interrelatedness of all of these issues under this history of white oppression and racism. My personal opinion is the ideal of why we might even begin to warrant the kind of cost that higher ed is the intermingling, is the connection. We're seeing that now in this online.
The cost of higher education is only justified because students get to be integrated.
Period. So much, I think, of the richness, the texture of what is the value of that experience gets lost when we can't mingle and rub elbows like that. So the contortions that we go through to support BIPOC students because of the history and because of the ongoing issues are necessary to support those students. But I think it compromises what the endeavor should be about because we continue to have these issues. So we're left, I believe, in this damned if you do, damned if you don't. Segregation and giving people an opportunity, safe spaces, I would I might say better than segregation, is warranted and necessary, but I think it creates new dynamics.
Safe spaces are warranted and necessary. So what he is saying is, no, we really shouldn't segregate students for their coursework, but what we should do is create safe spaces that are segregated.
I think it can further the distance that students in that space are feeling, because their experience in the space, in the diversity course, if it's just BIPOC people, can be very different from their other experience. And when you're young and developing, you're 19, 20, 21, you're developing your identity, you're developing a sense of the world.
I wonder how he would feel if, those oh, what is the word? I wonder how he would feel essentially if some of those students that end up getting segregated end up being conservative and end up making the argument against segregation in the segregated coursework that he's advocating for right now to give BIPOC folk a safe space. I wonder how that would work. Would conservative people of color be allowed in the safe space? Would they be allowed to make those arguments? Would they be allowed to speak up and say that they don't think that segregation should be a thing? I don't know. I mean, frankly, I would hope that some liberal folk would do that as well, but dare to dream.
You're being reinforced with something positive and necessary in the diversity courses, but then you're juxtaposing that with something outside, where that outside isn't privy to what happens in that space, isn't getting the advantage of that. And it just creates, I think, this tension that can be really difficult to hold and creates a new problem. The old problem might have been being out there and feeling alienated and unsafe, but now you've got this new psychological problem. So for me, it comes back to doing the work of deconstructing and tearing down our context of oppression and racism, so that we don't need to do these contortions, which I think create different sets of problems.
And I'd just like to build on that. One of the things I think it gets often, one of the pieces, and I don't think it's necessarily behind that question, but we don't understand that UVM is white space. David Roediger tells a story. He was teaching a class at the University.
UVM is white supremacist.
University of Missouri, and a white student kind of said, well, why do we have a Black Cultural Center? Why don't we have a white cultural center? And David, so he asked the question. So we said, what would you put it in? The only thing the kid could think of is Elvis. And so, Nell Irvin Painter talks about white identity. We didn't have time to get into this really, but she says that one of the things she says is that a major problem is that there's the inadequacy of white identity. And she says, like, whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothingness and racial hatred, right?
What the fuck? I'm sorry, guys. We're almost done. I'm gonna replay this one little bit here.
One of the things she says is that a major problem is that there's the inadequacy of white identity. And she says, like, whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothingness and racial hatred, right?
Whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothing and racial hatred. Dude, no.
And so, whiteness hasn't been a static concept. We have a sense of a changing, and we have a sense of the transition between kind of quote unquote Negro to Afro-American to African-American but we don't have any sense that in our past whites were highly racialized. There were something like 50 different racial groups of white people. And so, and by the time we get to World War II, that begins to shift and all ethnicities kind of melt into whiteness.
Oh my God, he said it! All ethnicities melted into whiteness. That's how you guys asked earlier about like the Italians and the Irish and the Jews? All the identities melted into whiteness. That is what the melting pot is it melts into whiteness and assimilates to whiteness.
But we need to, it's so much the norm at UVM that I'm sure that a lot of the white kids don't even, they don't even notice it. It's just reality. And so I think it's important to name that. And for that reason, the importance of affinity spaces and that type of work that needs to be done. But
I genuinely feel so bad for this guy. I really do. My heart breaks for this guy. And I just hope that he has someone in his life that loves him enough to say, honey, no, no.
I agreed that that can be problematic as well.
All right. Thank you so much to Kyle and Paul for taking some time to answer some of these questions. I also want to thank our incredible audience for all of the questions that you have provided us. We wanted to get to all of them, but as you can imagine, with all of the questions that we've been receiving, we haven't been able to cover every question. And unfortunately, this is all the time that we have today. So on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Center for Cultural Pluralism.
All right. I can't do it anymore. I can't, guys. That was nuts. That was nuts. I'm gonna have to process that webinar. And here's the thing too, is UVM actually has, hang on, let me get this up on my screen. Let me get it up on my screen somewhere. UVM actually has a whole bunch of other programs. What I can do, hang on, stop share screen, application window. Oh, where is it? Where'd it go? Here it is. UVM actually has a whole bunch of other of these videos up, so I suspect we will be returning to the UVM Diversity and Inclusion Library sooner rather than later. But I just want to remind you guys, listen, if you enjoyed this stream, I'm going to be doing an awful lot more of these. So I'm going to be getting a schedule together. I think things are going to be calming down precipitously after this week as we have some clarity about what the holy hell is going on. So I'm going to be having a schedule where we're going to do regular stuff like this. If you want to support my channel, the very best thing you can do is subscribe. Make sure you have your notifications turned on. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up. If you want to financially support my work, there are two really good ways to do that. One, you can become a member of the channel now. So I just turned memberships on today. You'll get some fun perks with that. The other thing, too, is that you can join my locals community, kb.locals.com, which also gives you access to other perks and other things that we do in there. So information about that is in the description below. I really do appreciate it. I'm losing my voice, but we have one last super chat here from Mr. Scott. Says, Scribe Light reviews TEDx videos like this on YouTube. He would definitely welcome you as a guest for one of his live review shows. He's on Twitter. I mean, I generally I'll pretty much talk to anyone that wants to reach out to me. I don't tend to pimp my stuff out for stuff like that though. But if he wants to reach out to me, I will definitely take a look. Thank you, Andrew B, for becoming a new member. Yay, Andrew, you are my second member ever. Maybe, no, I think you're my second. So that's awesome. And then I had one other here. Guys, if you think you're subscribed to the channel, just double check because every single night YouTube unsubscribes a couple hundred people from the channel. So if you think you're subscribed, always you want to double check. All right, guys, I am obviously losing my voice, but I appreciate you spending some time with me on this glorious Sunday. I will be back at you tomorrow with some videos, and then we'll be gearing up to go to DC this week. So maybe I will see some of you in Washington, DC. For right now, take care. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.